time a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 676 Forest Battle. The sky above Charleroi was a hazy gray, with soot and coal dust almost visible to the naked eye. When Colonel Fred and his troops first retreated here, they nearly fled due to the suffocating air. Charleroi is a major coal-producing city, and large-scale industries such as smelting, glass-making, chemicals, machinery, steel, and textiles developed around the Caser Forest coal mine. Looking out, the banks of the Sansel River were almost entirely lined with factories, their massive chimneys spewing thick, billowing smoke into the sky, and wastewater of various colors flowing into the river through huge drainage pipes, turning the entire river black and filling the air with a nauseating stench. The image above shows the ruins of the Caser Forest coal mine in Charleroi, once the heart of the city's development. A major mining disaster in 1956 killed 262 miners. It was later converted into a historical museum. Perhaps this is one of the reasons they made us hold this position, Colonel Fred said, putting away his binoculars as he stood by the river. He had just tried to find the source of the black water, but failed. The black water seemed endless. Lieutenant Colonel Enzo, the staff officer, remained silent. He knew Colonel Fred was right. The General Staff did not want to lose this energy and industrial city, as it would be a major loss for resource-starved Germany. However, Charleroi was bordered by forests to the west, the Ardennes Mountains to the south, the approaching Franco-Belgian forces to the north, and Namur, garrisoned by Charles's most elite troops, to the northeast. Holding such an isolated city was practically tantamount to waiting for death. Colonel, the staff officer suggested, we should perhaps deploy along the Sampere River. That might allow us to hold out longer until reinforcements arrive. Reinforcements? Colonel Fred smiled bitterly. You think there will be reinforcements, but this, the staff officer looked around. The General Staff wants to hold this place, and of course they will send reinforcements. Colonel Fred shook his head, looking helpless. Please, Enzo, the troops in Namur are the Charles's elite forces, the 1st Panzer Corps. And our 1st Tank Division has already been moved to the Somme to attack the British. Tell me, what other troops can reinforce Charleroi? Enzo pondered for a moment, realizing the colonel was right. On the surface, Namur hadn't severed the connection between Liège and Charleroi. There were still 2 highways and 3 side roads between them. However, any troops daring to reinforce Charleroi would be detected by Charles's reconnaissance aircraft immediately. Then, that reinforcement force would be surrounded and annihilated on the way by the Charles's 1st Panzer Corps, completely wiped out. That's one of the reasons why Charles' tanks haven't appeared before us yet, Colonel Fred said with a self-deprecating tone. You think he's afraid of us? No, he's besieging the city to lure reinforcements in. He hopes someone will come out of the Liège fortress and be delivered into his mouth. The staff officer turned pale. Reinforcements meant being tricked, so there wouldn't be any. What would happen to Charleroi? Death, or becoming prisoners of war? Colonel Fred seemed to see through the staff officer's thoughts. He reassured him, don't worry, Enzo, we'll survive. Colonel Fred turned his gaze to the Ardennes Mountains to the south. As long as we deploy our forces to the south, understand, the staff officer was taken aback, following the colonel's gaze south. You mean, the Ardennes Mountains are our escape route? Colonel Fred nodded slowly. Tanks need roads. They can't advance through mountains and jungles. That's our escape route, and our only escape route. Colonel Fred never intended to hold Charleroi from the beginning. That was unrealistic. His plan was to deploy 2 battalions in Charleroi, making it appear as if it were still in German hands. The main force was deployed in the southern mountains. A few kilometers away, there was a place called Black Village, which was ideal for defense, a vast expanse of black coal mines. Digging trenches and having soldiers roll on the ground would blend men and equipment into the environment. More importantly, in wartime, the Germans could ignite the coal piles, engulfing the surrounding area in smoke and a foul odor. In this environment, even Charles's fighters and tanks would likely be helpless. Then, the main force could easily withdraw into the forest for defense. Colonel, A communications soldier handed him a telegram from the general staff. The chief of the general staff has decided to promote you to major general. The Charleroi garrison will be reorganized into the 31st Division, with you as its commander. Furthermore, the chief of the general staff hopes you will hold Charleroi. Once the time is right, our army can launch a pincer attack on Namur and recapture it. Fred casually took the telegram, put it in his pocket without even looking at it, a contemptuous smile on his face. A pincer attack on Namur? This was nothing but a deceptive trick. The chief of the general staff hoped to wear down the enemy's manpower with the remaining troops, not to force them to surrender. Colonel, another communications soldier reported, Major Find reports that they've spotted French troops in the forest. What? Colonel Fred's expression changed drastically. Major Find was part of the unit he had sent to scout the Ardennes region. The discovery of French troops there, did it mean the French had already occupied the forest? Are you sure it's French? Colonel Fred asked. They might have mistaken the Belgian partisans for French troops, Colonel Fred thought. However, the reply a few minutes later disappointed Colonel Fred, confirmed French, and quite a few in number. Requesting your orders. Actually, orders weren't needed. The faint sounds of gunfire and explosions could be heard from the distant forest. Without a doubt, the two forces had clashed in the forest. Send reinforcements immediately, Colonel Fred ordered. Hold the forest entrance firmly. Yes, Colonel. The communications soldier turned and went to relay the order. Colonel Fred paced anxiously back and forth like an ant on a hot plate. How many French troops were deployed in the forest? If it was their main force, it meant their retreat was cut off. Colonel Fred's mind conjured a terrifying image, German troops, under attack from the char tank units, hoping to escape into the forest, only to have dark gun barrels suddenly emerge from behind the tree trunks, mowing down the unprotected and defenseless German soldiers one by one into pools of blood. No, Colonel Fred suddenly stopped, turning to his staff officer and ordering with a terrified expression, immediately organize the troops to prepare for a retreat into the forest. Yes, Colonel, the staff officer responded, then suddenly remembered that Colonel Fred had been promoted to Major General, and quickly corrected himself. Yes, General. Major General Fred frowned and waved his hand impatiently. Did this guy know that this was a matter of life and death? And he still cared about this. Chapter 677 Retreat. In Charleroi, Major General Fred's command post was located inside the steel mill on the banks of the Sanche River. This was Fred's choice. He feared that setting up the command post in an obvious villa or city hall would make it vulnerable to being targeted and eliminated by Charles's bombers. After all, this was Belgium, and everywhere you looked, there were Belgians with hateful eyes fixed on the Germans. They would leak intelligence to the partisans, who would then inform Charles, and then the bombers would come swarming in. However, even inside the steel mill, Major General Fred remained uneasy. He paced anxiously at his desk, occasionally stopping to stare at the map, trying to find a suitable direction for a breakout. West? Or south? Major General Fred preferred the south. Because the west was a vast primeval forest, and with the weather warming up, it was the time when venomous insects and wild animals emerged from hibernation. Moreover, the west faced the Somme battlefield, and even if he successfully crossed the forest, it was uncertain whether he would enter German or British territory. Neither seemed good. Entering British territory would mean becoming a prisoner, while entering German territory would mean being incorporated into the army and thrown into battle. The best option was undoubtedly the south. Crossing the Ardennes would lead to the German rear, allowing time for rest and reorganization even before engaging in battle. The problem was that the south might already be occupied by the French. General, the staff officer reported, the troops are ready. This fully demonstrated the quality of the German troops. In just 15 minutes, over 5,000 men were ready to march, and specifically, to retreat into the mountains. The soldiers even carried ropes for climbing, and some had even found horses for carrying heavy loads and livestock for food. Of course, all of these were urgently requisitioned from the Belgians. But Major General Fred still couldn't decide where to break out. Suddenly, he looked up at the staff officer. Have we been monitoring Charles's troops? Yes, the staff officer nodded. A reconnaissance company is lurking around Namur, and there are also some spies in the city. It wouldn't be a problem for the Germans to disguise themselves as Belgians. Most of the Belgians in the area spoke German, making it difficult to distinguish the Germans among them. So, Major General Fred asked, has there been any movement from Charles's troops? I haven't heard any reports, General, the staff officer replied. Major General Fred nodded slightly, his gaze returning to the map, and murmured, "So, the French troops appearing in those southern mountains aren't the troops stationed at Namur, but the 6th Army stationed along the Jean-Blau line, and they didn't bypass Charleroi from the east, but instead used the forests to the west." This was obvious. The east was open and teeming with German scouts, making it impossible for the French to bypass them undetected. The staff officer immediately understood Major General Fred's meaning. So, if the French are in the south, there must be more troops in the west, because that's their only route. Yes, Major General Fred nodded. It seems our only option is to break out from the south. At that moment, a communications officer delivered a telegram. "General, Major Find reports that they have routed the enemy." Requesting further orders, Major General Fred was overjoyed. As expected, the enemy's main force for the encirclement was in the west, not the south. The French troops to the south had likely only recently arrived, were few in number and exhausted, which is why they were repelled by a single infantry battalion led by Major Fernand. "Order them to hold their ground until we arrive," Major General Fred ordered. "Yes, General." Then, without hesitation, Major General Fred firmly ordered his staff, "Order the entire army to retreat south." "Yes, General." With the staff's order, the German army marched south in a massive wave. They carried virtually no heavy equipment. Artillery and ammunition that couldn't be carried were destroyed on the spot. Food was transported by trucks following the troops, but the furthest they could reach was the edge of the forest. When there was no road, they had to unload the food and burn the trucks. At the Namur Castle command post, Charles was discussing the supply issues for the infiltration with Tigeny. The troops needed far too many supplies. The fuel alone for the tanks was a huge burden, not to mention the spare parts that needed to be replaced when tanks broke down along the way. "The sidecar tanks might not be enough to meet our supply needs," Tigeny said. "The 1st Armored Corps has over 300 tanks. Even conservatively estimating a distance of 100 kilometers, we'd need at least 15,000 liters." Hearing this number, Charles frowned. Sidecar tanks had limited carrying capacity. Carrying 100 liters of gasoline up and down mountain roads was already a struggle, and even then, 150 sidecar tanks would be needed. The key point was that the sidecar tanks themselves consumed fuel, and the infiltration distance might exceed 100 kilometers. Even after reaching their destination, they would still need fuel for combat. After a moment's thought, Charles said, "We can transport the fuel into the forest first." "First?" Tigeny was taken aback. "Would that be too dangerous?" Charles replied in a deep voice, "The whole process will be done secretly. We'll set up several supply points along the marching route, each with underground fortifications to store fuel, food, and tank parts." Tigeny said "Oh," and nodded slightly. It seemed like a good idea. The downside was that if German skirmishers spotted them, they might guess the French operational objectives or even know their marching route. Charles was aware of this, but he believed the risk was manageable if the transport units conducted reconnaissance beforehand to confirm the area was uninhabited. "Another issue is the airdrop," Tigeny added. "If it were an open, flat area, airdropping wouldn't be too difficult. We could simply drop the signal flare. But we're entering the Ardennes Mountains, which are mostly covered by trees, making it difficult to find a place to drop the signal flare." To be precise, it wasn't that dropping it was difficult, but rather that even if it were dropped, the bombers in the air wouldn't detect it. Other methods included lighting smoke or firing signal flares, but those could easily reveal the position of the flanking troops or attract German attention. After a moment's thought, Charles replied, "Try using canvas as a signal. It can be spread out over a large area on the mountainside or even the treetops." The advantage of using canvas as a signal was that it was generally unaffected by terrain. Just then, a communications soldier knocked and entered, handing Charles a telegram. "General, the German troops in Charleroi are retreating south." Charles stared at the soldier in astonishment. He hadn't expected the Germans to retreat so quickly, especially south. He asked anxiously, "Is the 6th Army ready?" "Yes, they are," the soldier replied. Charles was somewhat surprised. While the Germans only had 2 possible escape routes, there were numerous points of attack. How could the 6th Army be ready at all points in such a short time? Or was Christine exaggerating? Chapter 678 Guiding the Enemy's Attack. This was a miscalculation on Charles's part. The 6th Army failed to hold every point. Christine was prepared for only one point, one of the 3 entrances to the Ardennes south of Charleroi. Or rather, they were indeed prepared. This was Tassigny's idea. and he personally led the troops, a single, under-strength infantry regiment with only light equipment, totaling a little over 2,000 men. Upon receiving Charles's order to blockade the Ardennes forest, Christine's first reaction was to send a mechanized division to cut in south of Charleroi as quickly as possible to prevent their escape. This was related to the ambiguity of Charles's orders. Due to the high degree of secrecy surrounding the strategic intent of penetrating the Ardennes, Charles's orders to Christine could only be, send infantry into the Ardennes to prevent the Germans from entering the mountains and escaping from here. Christine immediately thought of the 2nd Mechanized Division. This division was modeled after Charles's 1st Mechanized Division, and Christine believed this would allow for better learning and implementation of Charles's tactics. Christine's idea was that a mechanized division was also infantry, only infantry mounted on vehicles. Now is the time for mechanized divisions to shine. With fewer tanks but greater speed, they can reach the target area in a day if the tanks are abandoned. Furthermore, mechanized divisions can use their mobility and combat strength to maneuver and blockade the German forces. Pointing to the map, Christine said, "We can divide the 2nd Mechanized Division into 2 brigades, stationed on the west and south sides respectively, completely encircling Charleroi. 2 infantry divisions will then reinforce them, while the 1st Special Artillery Division will launch an attack from the front." This encirclement plan was quite ambitious: 2 infantry divisions, 1 mechanized division, and 1 armored division, a total of 4 divisions and nearly 70,000 troops, to surround the 5,000 German troops in Charleroi. This shows how much Christine valued the first combat mission given to him by Charles. However, this plan somewhat resembled the offensive theory of a direct, frontal battle, the only difference being the use of mechanized and armored units. However, Tassigny, who had just been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was a staff officer, stopped Christine from doing so. Tassigny pondered the map for a moment, then pointed to Charleroi and analyzed, "This might not be a good idea, General. I've heard the enemy in Charleroi has no intention of holding out, they're just waiting for orders to retreat. If we send the 2nd Mechanized Division, it might expose our intention to encircle them immediately. If the enemy retreats into the Ardennes before us, we won't be able to complete the mission assigned to us by command." But Christine disagreed. "The Germans won't retreat so quickly, Lieutenant Colonel. You may not know, but Charleroi is a major industrial city. It's very important to the Germans." Tassigny persisted. "General, if that's the case, why doesn't the Lieutenant General, referring to Charles, recapture Charleroi himself? We all know the 1st Panzer Corps is in Namur. The Lieutenant General could easily do it by detaching the 1st Mechanized Division. He assigned this task to us and specifically instructed the infantry." Tassigny turned to Christine, awaiting her reply. Christine paused. Realizing Tassigny's words made sense. Why would Charles need his own mechanized division when his existing ones could handle the mission? Therefore, the focus of this mission was on infantry, to avoid alerting the Germans and preventing their escape into the Ardennes. However, Christine then stared at the map, troubled. If the Germans have spies, even infantry will have a hard time evading them. This presented a contradiction. Containing 5,000 German troops required a significant force, and even infantry, marching in formation, would struggle to avoid German detection. "Unless we use small units, and lightly armed," Tassigny replied. "Small units, yes," Tassigny nodded, "an infantry regiment, kept under 2,000 men. Perhaps we can even disguise ourselves as Belgian militia to deceive the Germans." The Belgian militia also numbered considerably, but the Germans had consistently ignored them, except for the 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps assisting Charles. Christine considered for a moment, then frowned and shook her head. 2,000 men. We can't blockade the entire south with that force. There are at least 3 points of entry into the Ardennes. Christine was referring to the mountain roads leading into the Ardennes. The Germans would also have to advance along these mountain roads to retreat into the Ardennes. They couldn't simply cut down trees and carve a path from the start. "We don't need to hold every point," Tassigny replied. "We only need to hold one point." "Do you know which point the Germans will retreat from?" Christine didn't quite understand Tassigny's meaning. Or was he planning to take a chance? "No, General," Tassigny shook his head. "I don't know, but we can deliberately guide the Germans to retreat from a certain point." Christine looked confused. "Deliberately guide them?" Tassigny calmly pointed to the 3 passes in the Ardennes on the map and explained, "We've deployed a small force at each pass to create the illusion of a troop deployment. Then, we'll leave a trace or a sound at pass number 3 to track German scouts. Finally, our troops will be routed by German scouts here. Christine immediately understood the ingenuity of Tassigny's plan. The Germans would naturally assume that the French forces, deployed to Pass No. 3, were exhausted and thus routed by their scouts, creating an opening. Having won a battle and created a breach in the encirclement, the Germans would naturally choose to break out from there. What they didn't expect was that this was precisely the only pass with an ambush. But the Germans have over 5,000 men, Lieutenant Colonel, Christine asked. We only have 2,000, lightly armed. How can we stop them, General? Tassigny replied confidently. The Germans are also lightly armed. Christine was taken aback, but then understood. The Germans, wanting to retreat into the Ardennes, obviously couldn't carry heavy equipment. Both sides were lightly equipped, and the French, having been prepared for an attack and occupying advantageous terrain with well-constructed fortifications, likely found themselves unable to withstand the German force of just over 5,000 men, even though the French were less than half the size of the Germans. After a moment's thought, Christine made a decision. Excellent idea, Lieutenant Colonel. You personally led a regiment to the Ardennes to ambush them. I will have the mechanized division prepare. Once the Germans fall into the trap or the opportunity arises, I will immediately lead the mechanized division to reinforce you. Chapter 679 Forest Trap. The Ardennes Forest, located on the border of Belgium and Luxembourg, is also known as the Ardennes Highlands. Its average elevation is not high. The highest peak, Mount Botlange, is only 694 meters. However, due to its dense forests, complex terrain, and numerous swamps, it was considered an undevelopable wilderness by the locals. Major General Fred led his troops to Crossroad 3, where they stopped at the forest's edge. The highway ended, and beyond lay a narrow path, barely wide enough for 2 or 3 people to walk side by side. It was a mining route, riddled with ruts from hand-operated mining carts and haphazardly filled holes filled with stones and mud. The Ardennes region is rich in coal and iron ore. Once a mine was discovered, a path would be built, but these paths were often abandoned after losing their value. For example, these 3 paths were abandoned because of the easier, more valuable, and higher quality coal mines in the Kazare forest. Major General Fred raised his binoculars and looked towards the forest, seeing nothing but barren wasteland. A moment later, several German scouts emerged crouching low from the forest. They headed straight for Major General Fred, without saluting. The leading lieutenant reported, General, Major Finn has ordered us to meet you here. Major General Fred grunted and asked expressionlessly, what's the situation? Everything's normal, the lieutenant reported. The major is leading his troops forward to search. He wants to ensure the road is safe. Suddenly, several gunshots rang out from the forest, startling the German troops who were on alert. Guards immediately raised their rifles and stood in front of Major General Fred. Major General Fred, however, was unfazed. Based on years of combat experience, he knew the gunshots were at least several kilometers away. They only sounded close because of the height. The lieutenant glanced towards the forest, then turned to Major General Fred and explained, the major is still searching for the remaining enemy. They may have encountered a few more French soldiers. Major General Fred didn't speak. He wondered, if the reconnaissance troops could penetrate several kilometers into the forest, did that mean the road was safe? After a moment's thought, he concluded that it was. So he raised his hand and waved forward, and the troops marched in a large procession into the forest along the mountain path. Behind them, the truck drivers lit the fuel tanks with torches, and soon the road was ablaze with black smoke and fireballs, occasionally punctuated by explosions. A chilling wind swept through the depths of the forest. With the snow just beginning to melt, the mountain paths were covered in mud. The German soldiers had to use both hands and feet to climb the slopes, sometimes slipping halfway down. Descending was equally arduous. Unless they grabbed onto vines or were stopped by tree trunks, they would slide all the way down, ending up bruised and battered, or tumbling into deep ravines. The overhead branches and leaves constantly blocked the sunlight, casting only faint shadows on the ground. Strangely, these shadows shifted gently with the swaying of the trees, like a dazzling kaleidoscope. After more than an hour's march, the troops finally entered an open area. It was relatively flat and sunny, with a small stream flowing gently nearby. The German soldiers, already covered in mud, cheered and rushed out of the forest, as if abandoning darkness for light. General, the staff officer reminded Major General Fred, the soldiers need rest. They're not used to mountain marches. Besides, we should be safe now. Major General Fred nodded, a weight lifted from his heart when he gave the order to rest. Once inside the forest, it wouldn't be so easy for the French to catch up. This wasn't a place for tanks and vehicles. The French could only pursue them along the mountain paths. However, Major General Fred didn't notice the dark muzzles of guns peeking out from the surrounding jungle. It was the 192nd Infantry Regiment led by Tassigny. He had let the German scouts go. Or rather, he deliberately lured them into this open area. When the German scouts appeared, several remnants suddenly opened fire, and the German scouts swarmed back, guns drawn. Otherwise, the scouts might have discovered the ambush. The German soldiers were completely oblivious. Some rested against tree trunks, others fetched water from the stream with their canteens, and still others sat on rocks, taking off their shoes and scraping off the mud clinging to the soles, making their feet feel heavy. Major General Fred found a flat rock to sit on. Its surface, warmed by the sun, felt comforting. An orderly handed him his canteen, which he took and drank 2 gulps. Bang! Major General Fred fell backward to the ground, not even having time to utter a sound. His face was mangled beyond recognition, and the canteen fell to the ground, water gushing from the bullet hole. The bullet had passed through the canteen before striking Major General Fred. Such secondary injuries are often more lethal. The bullet tumbled and rolled after penetrating the canteen, leaving a gruesome mark on Major General Fred's face. The bullet might have continued to churn in his brain, churning his brains into a mess, as some white, tofu-like substance spurted from the wound. The orderly was so shocked he forgot to utter a sound. He stared blankly at the scene, still holding the bread he had intended to offer. The German soldiers instinctively looked in the direction of the gunfire, then whirled around to find Major General Fred dead. Quick-thinking soldiers immediately dropped to the ground and raised their rifles in response, but then gunfire erupted, volleys of bullets raining down from all directions. One after another, German soldiers fell into pools of blood, in various positions, some clutching their chests, some covering their heads, and others slumped into the stream, turning the entire water red. Only then did the Germans realize they had been tricked. There was nowhere to hide in this open area, while the enemy was concealed in the woods. The surviving Germans hastily pulled the triggers in the direction of the gunfire, but the bullets only struck the trees. In the ensuing chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Enzo took over command from Major General Fred. Crawling behind a rock, he waved his pistol and shouted to his soldiers, "On my orders, we must charge into the forest." The forest was their only escape route. The trees provided cover, and the leaves blocked out the sunlight. However, as Lieutenant Colonel Enzo organized a charge, the forest suddenly erupted with a roar of light machine guns. Crossfire from the trees felled German soldiers in droves. Then, grenades were thrown from the forest, creating a barrage of bullets. Lieutenant Colonel Enzo peered into the forest from the ground and discovered barbed wire. At that moment, Lieutenant Colonel Enzo knew they were doomed. This was a trap meticulously prepared by the French. Chapter 680 New Benefits. In the Battle of the Ardennes, the French army, with just over 2,000 men, routed 5,000 German deserters. Almost none of these deserters managed to escape. Tassigny's encirclement only had the entrance and exit points on the mountain roads, which were immediately sealed off by French fire. All other areas were heavily fortified with troops and barbed wire, making them impenetrable. Tassigny even positioned snipers and machine guns on high ground, relentlessly suppressing the German forces in the open area. The Germans, already demoralized, surrendered en masse after a brief resistance, realizing they couldn't break out. A post-battle count revealed over 3,700 prisoners, exceeding the total strength of the French forces involved. Charles was quite surprised when he received the telegram of victory. This battle seemed different from his impression of the French army. Although it lacked mechanized and armored units, it could still be described as adapting to local conditions and flexible and adaptable. Tassigny was indeed formidable. After reviewing the entire operation, Tassigny praised, "This command seems to have your touch, General." Tassigny was subtly inducing psychological responses in the Germans throughout, gradually leading them into an encirclement. Tassigny's reminder made Charles realize that this was indeed the case. First, they deliberately exposed their position to lure German scouts to Mountain Road No. 3. Then, they deliberately lost to the scouts, revealing a weakness. Later, they even used gunfire to signal to the main German force that the area behind this mountain road was safe. Finally, they lured the Germans into a prearranged encirclement and annihilated them, a brilliant victory. "What about the German reconnaissance unit?" Charles asked. Reconnaissance units are usually elite, and Charles worried that if they were scattered in the jungle, they might pose a threat to the infiltration of the Ardennes. "Don't worry," Tassigny said, waving the documents in his hand. They heard the gunfire from the rear and immediately rushed back to reinforce, only to be wiped out en route. Their radios were also captured. All 5 radios belonging to the main force were seized, most importantly, the radios. Even if some German stragglers escaped into the Ardennes and hid in the shadows, or even discovered the French advance through the mountains, they couldn't transmit the news without radios. Order Tassigny to search for the remaining enemy forces, Charles said calmly. Also, move the engineers, surveying units, and transport convoys there. Yes, General, Tassigny understood. Searching for the remaining enemy forces was a pretext. The real purpose was to maintain vigilance around the mountain road, keeping others unaware of the French operations. The engineers were used to repair roads and build bridges. The surveying teams assessed whether the roads and bridges repaired by the engineers could support the weight of the Charles A-1 tanks. As for the transport convoys, supplies were crucial. Sidecars would set up supply points along the road being repaired. Once everything was ready, the 1st Panzer Corps advance through the Ardennes would only take a day or 2. Spring breezes blew, and all things revived. In April, Namur was ablaze with thousands of bluebells, a purple sea stretching as far as the eye could see, adding a touch of magic to Belgium. The image above shows Belgian bluebells. Native to Ireland and Spain, standing atop the castle, Charles gazed at the vibrant colors below in the warm sunlight, a sense of melancholy washing over him. If it weren't for the war, it would be springtime, and the castle and picturesque hills would be bustling with tourists. But now, it was filled with guards and training soldiers. The only sound was the chanting of drills. 2 weeks had passed since the recapture of Charleroi, and Charles and the 1st Panzer Corps remained entrenched in Namur, unmoved. Moreover, Charles was actively reinforcing the Namur direction, deploying the 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps towards Liège, presenting a posture of attacking the Liège fortress. The Germans will believe it, won't they? Charles thought. After all, Liège was Belgium's most important and last city. Liberating Liège meant liberating all of Belgium. This was the hope of everyone in Belgium, including Albert I. Furthermore, once the Liège fortress was recaptured, the vast majority of troops stationed in Belgium could withdraw to reinforce other fronts, including Charles's forces. Because the Liège fortress was bordered by the Netherlands to the north and the Ardennes to the south, only a few tens of thousands of troops were needed to block the entrance and ensure Belgium's security. This was crucial for both the Central Powers and the Allied powers. However, the Germans certainly didn't expect that Charles was currently constructing a passage through the Ardennes, and was almost ready. General, a guard reported, King Albert I wishes to see you. Charles was somewhat surprised. Albert I had been busy stabilizing Charleroi. This industrial city was very important to Belgium, and in times of war, its recapture would allow Belgium to completely break free from its dependence on foreign sources for coal, iron, textiles, and glass products, and even export them. Therefore, Albert I dared not be careless. He personally went to organize the restart efforts and reopen the roads and railways damaged in the war. Let him in, Charles said, walking back to the command post up the castle stairs. Inside the command post, Charles had just sat down when King Albert I, beaming, stepped forward and warmly embraced him. It's a pleasure to meet you, Charles. He then stepped aside to let in a middle-aged man in a suit, top hat, and with a mustache. Let me introduce you, this is Mr. Gill, King Albert I said, the owner of the Surland Steelworks. Hello, General. Gill removed his top hat and bowed to Charles. It's a pleasure to meet you. The Surland Steelworks. Charles was taken aback. He had heard of the steelworks. It was the predecessor of China's Shaogang. Decades later, the European steel industry was in decline, and the Belgian Surland Steelworks was sold to China at scrap metal prices. At the time, China was extremely lacking in this technology, so it bought the entire Surland Steelworks, including the factory buildings, and shipped them back to China for reconstruction, even using the aluminum panels for the roofs and walls. Only after this did Shaogang's rapid development begin. The image above shows blast furnace number 4, purchased from the Thran Steelworks. What is it? Charles asked calmly. Charles should have made them both coffee and exchanged pleasantries, but as a military commander, he had neither the time nor the inclination for such formalities. Yesterday, the 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps recaptured the Thran Steelworks. Albert I glanced at Gill, a cold glint in his eyes seemingly carrying a hint of threat. Then he turned to Charles and said, as a token of gratitude, Mr. Gill is willing to sell you shares at a low price. I think this will benefit the general's business. Charles immediately understood what was going on. To deeply bind his interests, Albert I had offered another benefit. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 681 Surland Steel Plant. Charles was right. Jill had no intention of selling the Thrall Steelworks. He had been vacationing in the United States, enjoying life with his family at their seaside villa in Washington. Jill believed that if there was any safe and comfortable place in the world, it was America, not even the world's leading power, Great Britain, which was also facing shortages due to the German blockade. That day, as he leisurely sunbathed and drank red wine on his deck chair, he received a telegram from Belgium. To his surprise, the telegram was from Albert I am pleased to inform you, Mr. Jill, that we will soon recapture the Thrall Steelworks. For wartime reasons, if you do not return to handle it, we will nationalize the steelworks. After all, no one would willingly risk their blood and lives to recapture it and then present it to you, wouldn't you say? Jill jumped up from his deck chair as if stung by a needle, exclaiming, "My God, they've actually reached Thrall." Thrall wasn't just the name of the steelworks, it was a small town, only 10 kilometers from the Liège fortress. If the Belgian army reached Surland, it would mean that the entire territory of Belgium would soon be recovered. No, I can't abandon the steel mill. Jill hurriedly packed his bags, said goodbye to his family, and boarded the car back to Belgium. Charleroi City Hall. Major General Eden was puzzled by King Albert I's decision to give the Surland steel mill to Charles. Your Majesty, shouldn't you reconsider? Major General Eden said, Surland is not just a steel mill, it's also a machine shop. Our country's first train was built at Surland. The Surland steel mill was Belgium's largest steel mill, producing 1.1 million tons of steel annually, nearly half of Belgium's total output. Note, before and after World War I, Belgium's steel production was not large, around 2.467 million tons per year. In the 1980s, the Surland steel mill alone produced 3 million tons annually. I know, King Albert I said calmly. It is the lifeblood of Belgium, Your Majesty, Major General Eden said. Steel controls our economy, military, and industrial development. Without it, we have nothing. King Albert I turned to Major General Eden and asked, do you think Charles needs these things to control Belgium? Major General Eden suddenly understood. Charles didn't need the Surland steel works to control Belgium's lifeblood. He possessed an invincible army, controlled the FN arsenal, and was building Belgium's defense system. Any one of these was enough to shake Belgium's foundation. So what did it matter if Charles had another handle? But, Major General Eden still didn't understand, the Surland steel works are crucial to Belgium's economy. We could simply not give it to Charles and pretend nothing happened. Charles hadn't said anything anyway, he was content with what he had. Would giving away the Surland steel works be redundant? King Albert I chuckled softly, reminding him, Major General, have you forgotten where the Thrall steel works is located? Major General Eden hadn't forgotten, but rather didn't know the connection between the two. However, a quick glance at the map revealed the location of the Thrall steelworks. It was a small town in the province of Liège, only 10 kilometers from the Liège fortress. Protecting the Thrall steelworks required ensuring the safety of the Liège fortress. Otherwise, it would be within range of the fortress's cannons. King Albert I calmly asked, now, do you think we should give it to the Charles? Major General Eden nodded emphatically, yes, Your Majesty, it's an excellent investment. Your consideration is correct, far-sighted, and insightful. King Albert I smiled slightly, saying nothing more. Major General Eden was only considering the matter from a military perspective. From another perspective, from the need to suppress domestic capitalists, it was also the right thing to do. As Major General Eden said, the Surland steel works produce nearly half of Belgium's national output, and its owner, Jill, controlled Belgium's military, economy, and industry through it. Even the powerful Albert I had to show him deference. If Belgium had to listen to Charles, Boyda, Jill, and so on, then why not just kick Boyda, Jill, and the rest out? From then on, they only needed to listen to Charles. At least Charles was a friend, a capitalist with a conscience, and someone who couldn't be kicked out. This was a power play, which Major General Eden didn't understand, nor did he need to. At this moment, Jill was brought in by the guards. He excitedly shook hands with Albert I and said gleefully, "Thank you very much, Your Majesty, unbelievable. We've reached Aaron so quickly. I knew that under your leadership, the Belgian people would surely drive out the invaders and achieve final victory. You are a wise leader and an excellent commander." Albert I sneered inwardly. If you knew all this, you shouldn't have hidden away in America doing nothing, only returning now to reap the benefits. However, Albert I didn't show it. He politely invited Jill to sit down at his desk. "Now that you're back, let's talk about the shares in the Aaron Steelworks, Mr. Jill." Jill looked surprised and hesitated for a moment before saying, "But you said in your telegram that I wouldn't nationalize it now that I'm back." Albert I raised an eyebrow. "I certainly don't intend to nationalize it, but I think you should sell the shares to Charles." "Charles?" Jill looked shocked and said with difficulty, "That, Mars of France." Even though he was out of touch with the world in America, he had heard of Charles's name. It was hard for him not to know that it was already widely known, even in America. "Yes," Albert I nodded slightly, taking a pre-prepared document from a drawer and handing it over. "This is the acquisition plan. If there are no problems, sign it." Jill glanced at the document, his face instantly turning ashen. "No, selling 50% of the shares at half price? This is outrageous, is that so?" Albert I's expression darkened, coldly staring at Jill as he interrupted him. "Let me tell you what will happen, Mr. Jill. If you don't agree, the Thram Steelworks will have nothing to do with it, Charles, and the 1st Special Reconnaissance Army will have no reason to sacrifice their lives to protect the steelworks. I believe you know what will happen." Chapter 682 is still Charles's tactics. Namur Castle Command Center. When Jill stood before Charles, he realized that handing over the steel mill was impossible. Otherwise, Jill had reason to believe that the Thran steel mill would be reduced to ruins, leaving him only with a pile of scrap metal. However, Jill's heart was still bleeding. Selling 50% of the shares at half price was not much different from selling scrap metal. The difference was that the steel mill would have Charles, a strong man, in charge, and Jill would hardly have to worry about risks and could simply enjoy the profits. Comparing the two, Jill felt there was no reason to hesitate. He took out a document from his briefcase and handed it to Charles, his tone respectful, but his eyes revealed reluctance. "General, this is our offer. If you are satisfied." Charles glanced at the document. $12.5 million. It was a huge sum, but Charles knew it was definitely worth it, even though he had seen the Thran steel mill. Charles readily agreed. "No problem, I'll transfer the money to you right away." "No, General," Albert I interrupted Charles, "you can wait until the situation stabilizes before making a decision." The situation might change then. The implication was that since the Liège fortress hadn't been recaptured yet, and German artillery could directly bombard the Aaron Steelworks, the stock price might even fall, making the 50% stake less expensive. Jill glanced at Albert I, his face pale, as if to say, "Your Majesty is wise, and you're certainly generous with other people's money." Charles didn't intend to take advantage of this small sum. The Aaron Steelworks were crucial to him. It would allow the Bernard Group to completely break Schneider's monopoly, something far more valuable than tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Therefore, Charles politely declined Albert I's offer. "Thank you very much, Your Majesty. However, this amount of money is nothing to the Bernard Group. I'm very willing to reach a cooperation agreement with Jill as soon as possible." Charles clearly sensed Jill's relief. In the small town of Darvaz, Djokovic was discussing potential industrial property rights issues with Stokes regarding tank guns. "Although our tank guns aren't exactly the same as the 75mm gun," Stokes said with a worried expression, "they are actually derived from the 75mm gun. The principles and parts have many similarities, some even just scaled down. I'm worried that this might cause problems for Schneider." Djokovic agreed, thinking for a moment before thoughtfully asking, "Then, are these principles and parts similar to the British 6-inch gun?" "Of course," Stokes nodded firmly. "Although there are some differences, they're not significant." Djokovic pointed a finger in the air and said seriously, "Therefore, we have existing technology and prototypes. There's absolutely no need to copy the 75mm gun, Mr. Stokes." Stokes was taken aback. The calibers were vastly different. The 6-inch gun was a 152mm howitzer, so copying the 75mm gun was certainly more appropriate. But when he saw the faint smile on Joka's face, he instantly understood. "Yes, of course, Mr. Joka, we have the technology for 6-inch cannons, and we produce smooth-bore cannons. This is completely different from the French 75mm rifled cannon, definitely completely different. It's obviously derived from the 6-inch cannon, even the production line is the same." Joka and Stokes exchanged a smile. The truth was, the 75mm cannon had been completely altered. If there was any similarity, it was that the caliber was the same at 75mm, but this was outside the scope of industrial property rights. At this moment, there were several knocks on the door. After receiving permission, the secretary brought in a telegram. "Mr. Joka, General Charles has called, requesting that you transfer $12.5 million to this account when you have time to purchase a 50% stake in the Surland steel mill." Joka felt nothing. He was new to business and lacked experience. Although he had heard of the Surland steel mill, it was merely hearsay. He had no real understanding of this Belgian steel mill. Stokes exclaimed in surprise. "Theron Steel planned $12.5 million for 50%. Joka asked, "Is it worth it? Are you kidding?" Stokes looked incredulous. "Of course it's worth it, Mr. Joka. It's practically buying control of Belgium. No one would sell it for such a low price. You couldn't even buy it with money." Before he could finish, Stokes understood. It was because the buyer was Charles. Joka raised an eyebrow and joked, "It's the winner's prize. Military, political, and business, under Charles's control." They were forming a virtuous cycle, snowballing larger and larger. Namur Command Center. After confirming the funds had arrived and signing, Charles saw off Albert I and Jill. Their expressions differed. Albert I looked triumphant, as if he had won a battle, while Jill sighed and looked dejected. Charles was satisfied with the deal. He understood Albert I's intention. Only by recapturing and holding Liège could the Thraland Steel Works be truly safe. The two were essentially one. Charles was willing to board this ship. It was the Liège fortress, wasn't it? After penetrating the Ardennes, the Germans defending Liège would feel a chill run down their spines, and their defenses would need to extend into the Ardennes. Just as Charles was contentedly flipping through the Thraland Steel Works documents, Tidjany, who was at the radio station, suddenly rushed to Charles with a telegram. "General, the Russians have launched a counter-offensive, a massive counter-offensive. They've concentrated 4 army groups, 570,000 men, to attack the Austro-Hungarian defenses, and within hours, they've simultaneously broken through enemy lines from 2 points, achieving a major victory." Charles was momentarily stunned. He glanced at the calendar on the table to confirm it was only April. "They attacked ahead of schedule," Charles said. "What?" Tidjany didn't understand Charles's meaning. "I meant Brusilov. He should have waited until June to attack." Charles frowned. But Charles immediately realized that this might not be Brusilov's decision. Russia was on the verge of collapse, and they desperately needed a victory to avert a potential revolution. Therefore, knowing a feasible plan, they couldn't wait to reap the rewards prematurely. "How did you know the commander was Brusilov?" Tidjany looked at Charles in shock. The next second, Tidjany understood. "You've met him, haven't you? This is the tactic you gave him? Or is this victory also your doing?" Charles didn't answer, which was tantamount to admitting it. Tidjany looked dejected. Just now, he thought that a commander other than Charles and a completely new tactic had appeared in the world. Unexpectedly, it was still Charles's tactic. Chapter 683 Irwin's Tactics. "Why didn't the attack in April work?" Tidjany asked, not understanding the difference between April and Charles's original plan for June. Charles didn't answer but instead asked, "What are the characteristics of Brusilov's attack this time?" "New tactics," Tidjany replied. "I heard it's multiple breakthroughs, with one point as the main focus. Anything else?" Charles prompted. "What new equipment did they use?" Tidjany took the telegram, trying to find the answer, but unfortunately, it wasn't written there. Such specific tactical details, especially the combination of rudimentary equipment, were usually overlooked and didn't reach France quickly from Russia. "It's sleds and Maxim guns, Major General," Charles replied. "To be precise, sleds are used in winter before the snow melts, and in summer when the snow melts, they switch to wagons and Maxim guns." "You taught them this?" Tidjany smiled wryly, then seemed to understand. "In April, the snow in Russia hasn't melted yet, so they use sleds. Halfway through the battle, they suddenly find there's no snow left, and then they need to switch from sleds to wagons." Tidjany knew that Russian weather wasn't like France. The average temperature in April was around 0 degrees Celsius. Charles nodded. Clearly, everyone, including Brusilov, had overlooked this. Or rather, they hadn't overlooked it, but they had oversimplified the conversion between the two. And indeed, that was the case. Brusilov returned to Russia and reported the entire conversation with Charles to the Tsar, and the battle plan immediately received the full support of Tsar Nicholas II. The Tsar praised the tactical diagram before him, truly a battle plan devised by Charles. Everyone is thinking about digging trenches for defense, but it's not defense, it's retreat, even a rout. Besides that, there's nothing. Everyone is pessimistic and negative. Only Charles, only he would consider an attack at this time, and a completely new offensive tactic, even thinking of sleds and Maxim guns. Brusilov stood before the Tsar, holding his military cap and bowing slightly. Yes, Your Majesty, this shows that our waste of vast sums of money and manpower on the Tsar tank is unnecessary. We should immediately stop this project, all of it, because anything that can't be deployed on the battlefield will not help us at all. Although it seems impressive, it will only drag us down and worsen our already insufficient funds. Nicholas II nodded vigorously. That's right, General. Sleds and Maxim guns are the opposite. We can equip ourselves with thousands upon thousands of such vehicles instantly. More importantly, it's something the Germans can't learn. Brusilov was stunned. The Germans couldn't learn it? Then he understood. Yes, the Russians had long lived in the icy wilderness, and even civilians could easily drive sleds. The Germans could too, because it wasn't difficult. However, the battlefield required skilled drivers who could maneuver sleds nimbly through tree trunks, between rocks, and even across enemy trenches. These were things the Germans couldn't do. I can't wait to witness this victory, my general, Nicholas II said, his eyes darting across the map, his face beaming with excitement. Why don't we launch an attack immediately? If we can gather enough troops in a month, Your Majesty, Brusilov replied. Charles advised me to launch the attack in June. I think he considered not only the Germans' difficulty adapting to the June climate, but also the issue of converting sleds and wagons. Nicholas II laughed heartily. Is that a problem for us? Many of us have spent our entire lives on sleds and wagons, General. Brusilov also felt it wasn't a major problem. Sleds and wagons weren't expensive. More importantly, there were horses. He agreed with Nicholas II's decision. However, having always fought a defensive battle and never launched an offensive, they hadn't anticipated that their supply lines would be stretched as the front lines advanced. When the snow melted and the frost thickened, even transporting supplies became difficult. Replacing the large number of sleds with horse-drawn carts wouldn't be as simple as they had imagined. Along the English Channel, Montreal was shrouded in mist and rain. Major General Irwin, hiding behind a trench, observed the enemy lines through binoculars. For weeks, he had relentlessly pursued the British Expeditionary Force, finally bringing them here. His plan was clear: use the 1st Tank Division as the main force to advance along the Somme River and isolate the British from France. Once we capture Montreal, we can encircle Dunkirk, and all of Belgium, Major General Irwin exclaimed excitedly, watching the British lines amidst the gunfire. Encircling Charles's forces, what an exciting moment. The Somme River was a natural barrier. Just a few infantry divisions could perfectly sever this battlefield from France. Belgium, further hampered by the Ardennes mountains and forests, had only one exit, a few dozen kilometers wide. A pincer attack from the Germans would have been sufficient to seize British trenches and lines of defense, which would then become crucial for the German forces blockading the Charles. The red line in the map represents the Somme River, the southern border is the French defense zone, the northern border the British defense zone, and the red circle marks Montreal. Dunkirk was not only a vital port for British landings, but also a keynote in the blockade of Belgium. However, Irwin's offensive stalled at Montreal. The British frequently deployed warships to provide naval gunfire support for the ground forces. Although the naval guns were not highly accurate, their firepower was considerable, and Irwin's several attacks were repelled by the warships. General, just as Major General Irwin was pondering how to overcome this obstacle, a communications soldier reported, "There's been a change on the Eastern Front. The Russians are counterattacking our lines, and our casualties are heavy. We are in retreat." What? Major General Irwin looked at the communications soldier in surprise. Once the Eastern Front collapses, any significant gains on the Western Front will be futile. What's going on with Russia? Why has it suddenly launched a counter-offensive and even achieved victory, when it has always been the one being suppressed by the German army? General, just as he was thinking this, another communications soldier brought a telegram. "The chief of the general staff has telegraphed. requesting that you expedite the offensive and achieve a swift victory. Major General Irwin grunted in agreement. He understood Buckingham's meaning. A retreat on the Eastern Front meant that German resources would have to be diverted to the Eastern Front, and even troops from the Western Front would have to be transferred there. If the Somme River could not be captured quickly, it meant that victory might be impossible. But Montreal was not a place that could be taken in a short time. Suddenly, a bold idea popped into Major General Irwin's mind. Since the British had concentrated their forces and even their navy here, why not bypass it and attack Dunkirk directly? Chapter 684 Tank Battle. Montreuil, the headquarters of the British Expeditionary Force. Haig was frantically working behind the collapsed walls, while outside, wounded soldiers being carried away and evacuated troops were scattered everywhere. Shells whistled through the air, exploding nearby. The roar of fighter planes was incessant, occasionally swooping down to strafe the ground, causing screams of agony among the British troops below. The British resistance at Montreuil was arduous. Their artillery range was inferior to the enemy's 105mm howitzers, their aircraft were outnumbered, and their tanks were less advanced. Most critically, almost all of the British defensive lines faced Belgium. No one had anticipated the Germans advancing along the Somme and launching an attack from the rear. The British would have been driven all the way to the sea, but fortunately, Kitchener requested assistance from Balfour, which brought in 3 battleships, including HMS Queen Elizabeth, and 5 cruisers, whose naval guns managed to halt the German advance. General, the communications soldier ran to Haig amidst the gunfire, reporting at the top of his lungs, "Good news. The Russians have launched a counter-offensive on the Eastern Front and achieved victory." Haig merely glanced back at the communications soldier before continuing to stare at the map, pondering how to repel the next German attack. He didn't trust the Russians. He believed that even if they launched a counter-offensive, it would be small-scale and have no impact on the overall situation. As for victory, he thought they would be lucky to hold their lines. Haig had no expectation of them winning, not even a small victory. Unexpectedly, the communications soldier reported, "The Russians, under the leadership of General Brusilov, have killed or wounded over 100,000 German soldiers." Haig was stunned. He wondered if he had misheard and turned to the communications soldier in confusion. "What did you say, 100,000? "Yes, General." The communications soldier handed over the telegram. Haig took the telegram and saw that it indeed contained 100,000. What was going on with the Russians? But this was a surprise, absolutely a surprise. Excellent, Haig's furrowed brow instantly relaxed. The Russians' victory on the Eastern Front means much less pressure on us. He then asked, "How are the Russians doing? Is their victory continuing?" "I think so, General," the communications officer replied. "The Russians are well prepared for this counter-offensive. They have amassed 570,000 men to launch a counter-offensive against the Austro-Hungarian lines, and the Austro-Hungarian army is collapsing." Haig nodded with satisfaction, let out a long sigh, and turned his gaze back to the map. This time, however, he wasn't thinking about defense but about a counter-offensive. This was the British Army's opportunity, Haig thought. Only by launching a counter-offensive and achieving victory while the German army was in disarray could they restore the dignity of themselves and the British Expeditionary Force. He even put on an air of confidence, telling his staff, "We've lured the Germans here to extend their supply lines and use the Lys River defenses to semi-encircle them. Now, it's time for us to counterattack, teach the Germans a lesson, and make them groan under our guns." The Lys River is east of Montreal, and Montrealka is between the Lys River defenses and the English Channel. Which is also the reason Irwin attacked Montreal. Haig's words were a veneer of strategy. He cleverly transformed the British Expeditionary Force's previous defeat into luring the enemy deep into their territory. If he could lead the British Army to victory, everyone would be impressed by his brilliant strategy and military talent. The staff officer understood perfectly and wrote down these words, which he would then readily leak to reporters, subsequently building momentum for Haig's counterattack and victory in the media. However, before the staff officer could relay the message, a communications soldier guarding the telephone suddenly shouted, his voice shrill with panic, like the cry of a nightingale, "General, the Germans are attacking. Their tanks are tearing through our lines along the Lys River." Colonel Terence requests reinforcements. Haig was stunned. He hadn't expected the Germans to not adopt a defensive posture, but instead concentrate their armored forces on an attack, targeting the Lys River line. Were they planning to bypass Montreal? Haig's face instantly turned ashen. The entire British expeditionary force was concentrated in Montreal for defense. The area to the north was mostly occupied by logistics troops, wounded soldiers, and newly arrived reinforcements, their defensive lines being in the opposite direction. Once the Germans advanced along the Lys River into the heart of the territory, they would wreak havoc like tigers among sheep. The Germans could possibly advance all the way to Dunkirk. Haig's recently regained confidence was shattered once more. He was completely lost, even more panicked than before. He realized that if the German army reached Dunkirk and captured this vital supply port, hundreds of thousands of British troops would have no choice but to surrender or swim back to Britain across the English Channel. Reinforcements, Haig shouted hoarsely, reinforcements immediately. Send out all the tanks. We must stop the German advance. The British and German armies engaged in the first ever tank battle on the banks of the Lys River amidst the rain and fog, with over 800 tanks deployed on both sides. However, it was less a tank battle and more a massacre. Irwin had anticipated the British would send tank reinforcements, so he simultaneously launched his attack and organized his troops to prepare defenses near the Lys River. This is their weakness. Irwin smiled slightly when he saw British tanks appear in the aperture of his binoculars. But they really should have waited for our tanks to pass. The British Whippet tanks were no match for the German tanks, which was one of the reasons Irwin was able to relentlessly pursue the British expeditionary force. Irwin confidently raised his hand and waved it forward lightly. Forward, the German commander shouted, his voice cold and confident. Tanks, leading their troops, surged forward in a mighty march, their steps measured and their gazes resolute. The outcome was never in doubt. The British suffered a crushing defeat, despite possessing over 500 tanks, nearly twice the number of the Germans. Haig had hoped they would lead the expeditionary force to the glory of the British Empire, but instead, they became piles of smoking, burning scrap metal. The German tank losses, however, were negligible. Of their 200 tanks, only 50-odd were lost, a significant portion due to malfunctions. The victorious 1st Panzer Division did not linger. Under the personal command of Major General Irwin, it continued its northward march towards Dunkirk. Major General Irwin's move was risky. His tanks didn't even have enough fuel to reach Dunkirk. But Irwin still believed in victory. We will get the fuel, Irwin said casually to his men. What you need to do is watch out for oncoming vehicles. Don't rush to blast them into the air, that might be the gasoline we need. Chapter 685, A Tale of Two Extremes. The German tanks did indeed get gasoline and even managed to achieve some success. Meanwhile, the British were still transporting newly manufactured tanks and artillery from Dunkirk along the road to Montreal. As a result, the route was littered with tanks destroyed by the Germans. The Whippet, in the British definition, was more like an infantry tank, designed to cover advancing infantry and suppress enemy infantry. This tank was completely unsuitable for tank warfare. Although it was equipped with 4 machine guns, none of them could penetrate enemy armor. That afternoon, after more than 5 hours of continuous advance, the exhausted Major General Irwin finally led the German 1st Tank Division to the outskirts of Dunkirk. Seeing the Gothic architecture of Dunkirk in the distance and the British soldiers hastily constructing fortifications outside the city, the German tank crews cheered. Victory was within their grasp. If they captured Dunkirk, the demoralized British expeditionary force might collapse entirely. The reports from various international media outlets could be described as a tale of two extremes. On one side, Russia was achieving a major victory on the Eastern Front, killing and wounding over 100,000 enemy soldiers and capturing 30,000 in its first battle, and the gains were still expanding. On the other side, the German army bypassed Montreal and approached Dunkirk. Dunkirk was the closest port city to Britain, only about 40 kilometers across the Strait of Dover to the British port of Dover, making it the best port for the British Expeditionary Force to transport supplies and troops. If it fell to the Germans, the British landing route to France would be cut off, and millions of British Expeditionary Force soldiers would be trapped north of the Somme with nowhere to escape. Without ammunition and supplies, their only option would be surrender. This would undoubtedly be a fatal blow to the British Army and even Britain's global prestige. Therefore, the British newspaper The Times barely mentioned the Russian victory, as it was irrelevant to Britain. It devoted a huge section to the German offensive on Dunkirk. The accompanying image was a blurry photograph, a group of German tanks advancing towards the British lines from a distance. Only a few tanks and gun barrels were vaguely visible, while the foreground showed the panicked faces of British soldiers and rudimentary field fortifications. We were unprepared, no one was prepared, because no one expected the Germans to appear at Dunkirk from the rear. People thought they were stuck in Montreuil and unable to move, but the fact is the Germans came, only a few kilometers from Dunkirk. This caused enormous panic. Although we had 50,000 men at Dunkirk, most of them were inexperienced recruits. They lacked anti-tank weapons and didn't know how to fight tanks. Many were fleeing Dunkirk. Tickets were incredibly hard to come by. The French newspaper Le Petit Paris stated, "We cannot stand idly by and watch Dunkirk fall to the Germans, because it means the collapse of the British Expeditionary Force, and if that happens, Britain will be unable to provide reinforcements and supplies to France for a considerable period of time, not even in the future." French politicians feared that Britain would withdraw from the war altogether. Admittedly, Britain's involvement in this war was not for France's sake. It did not want a unified and powerful empire to emerge on the European continent, whether that empire was France or Germany. However, if the price to pay was Britain's collapse or even the loss of its last drop of blood, Britain would still choose to protect itself. The little Daily News's reports were full of sarcasm. The British always surprise us. While Charles achieved victory at the front with minimal losses, the British set a record for the highest single-day casualties at the Somme. When the Russians began their counter-offensive on the Eastern Front, the British began their retreat. They are always erasing our victories. I mean no harm, but is this really the army of the world's strongest nation? In the Paris city government, urgent phone calls and telegrams kept being sent to Brian's desk in the Prime Minister's office. Brian was overwhelmed with the work. Even when Clemenceau walked into the office, he was still on the phone dealing with British requests for help. Brian gestured for Clemenceau to sit down, replying respectfully, "I understand, Your Excellency Marshal. We will certainly reinforce Dunkirk, please rest assured." "Yes, I understand, this also concerns the fate of France." After hanging up the phone, Brian sighed deeply, shaking his head as he walked towards Clemenceau. Unbelievable, the Germans actually reached Dunkirk. There are over 1 million troops in that area, and the German army is less than half theirs. Clemenceau hummed in agreement, his voice soft but his tone heavy. This German army is the same one that was besieged by Charles and Hasselt. After breaking out, they reorganized the 1st Tank Division. Brian, who was about to sit down on the sofa opposite him, paused upon hearing this, glancing at Clemenceau in surprise. After a few seconds, he slowly sat down, cautiously, as if sitting on a landmine. Silence fell over the office, an uneasy atmosphere spreading and growing stronger. Neither of them spoke, but both understood what the other was thinking. Charles, with only 20,000 men, could easily surround and defeat the German army, and this same German army that Charles defeated could rout a 1 million-strong British army. Did that mean Charles was invincible and no one could stop him? After a long silence, Clemenceau handed a cigar to Brian, and the two lit it in hushed tones, as if trying to dispel their worries through the burning tobacco. "This might be our chance," Clemenceau broke the silence after a while. "We can order Charles to rescue Dunkirk, but Charles's troops are currently facing off against Liège at Namur." Brian frowned. Galen has already discussed this in Parliament. He believes the Germans have prepared for both scenarios. If Charles is transferred to Dunkirk, the German forces in Liège will launch an attack. Clemenceau didn't speak, but simply looked at Brian. Brian suddenly understood, this was exactly what Clemenceau wanted. "Britain is more important than Belgium, Your Excellency," Clemenceau replied calmly. "If we had to choose between the two, we would certainly prioritize Britain's security." "What do you say?" Brian considered for a moment, then nodded heavily. This was a perfect excuse. It would force Charles to lose Belgium. He had heard that Charles had made numerous arrangements in Belgium, including the defense systems of several cities, the Thayron Steel Works and the FN Arsenal, and the full support of Albert I. Thinking of this, a long absent smile appeared on Brian's face. "Yes, that is the current situation. I believe General Gallieni will also make the right choice." Chapter 686 Save the British, or Defeat Germany? At the House of Representatives in Bourbon Palace, Brian personally convened a session. During the meeting, Brian delivered a passionate speech. "Gentlemen, this is a war between the Allied and the Central Powers. Our allies are collapsing, they need our help. Indeed, General Gallieri's concerns are valid, and Belgium is also our ally, but considering the overall interests of the Allied powers, we should prioritize the security of Britain, not Belgium. Moreover, if we lose Britain as an ally, we will soon lose Belgium and even the Charles. Therefore, we must not allow such a thing to happen." even at a cost. At the same time, I believe these costs are necessary and worthwhile. It concerns our honor, the honor of all people, and the honor of France. Brian even broke his usual gentle and refined demeanor, clenching his fist and shouting at the members of Parliament, his voice hoarse with fervor. As soon as he finished speaking, applause erupted in the hall, and the members of Parliament echoed Brian's call. Britain is our most steadfast ally. They have millions of troops, and we must ensure their safety. Dunkirk cannot be handed over to the Germans. It is our link with Britain. If the British are defeated, we will be defeated as well. It's only a matter of time. But Wells rose and walked to the podium, loudly objecting. Gentlemen, let us recall what victories the British have achieved on the battlefield. Was it the defense of Paris, the defense of Ypres, or the Battle of the Somme? I'm sorry, but so far, I haven't heard of a single victory achieved by the British Army alone. More defeats and interference against us. This immediately drew a chorus of opposition from the audience. In any case, Britain is our ally. They relieved the pressure on our lines. Our victories also have their share, otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to win. Steed rose, his voice, though aged, deep and powerful. Is that so? Perhaps you've forgotten that most of the Charles victories were achieved without the participation of the British Army. If British troops were involved, it would mean they were helping the British in the Dardanelles, or even that Charles saved them. Otherwise, the British not only didn't help, they were an obstacle. For example, in the attack on Antwerp, Charles's troops were almost cornered by the British blockade. Armand rose gracefully, straightened his collar, strode onto the podium, turned to face the audience, and casually placed his hands on the wall. I don't understand military matters, gentlemen. I only want to ask one question. If we ourselves could defeat the Germans and end this war, why do we need the British to join in and save them? You all know how many victories Charles has won. I believe Charles's decision is correct, and I believe he will lead us to victory. And you are more willing to believe the British, who haven't won a single victory, simply because they have more troops. Someone shouted from below. You have too much faith in Charles. The Germans have advanced from the rear to Dunkirk, and they will then invade Belgium. Yes, even Charles couldn't win under these circumstances. Armand remained silent, turning his gaze to the audience behind the podium. Gallieni stood there listening quietly, without uttering a word. All eyes were on Gallieni. The noisy meeting room suddenly fell silent. People wanted to know one thing. Was it possible for Charles to lead France to victory without British help? Gallieni hesitated for a moment, then said, I'm not so sure, gentlemen, but I know Charles does have a plan. I can't say too much. I can only say this. If Charles can capture the Liège fortress, are you willing to forego this opportunity to send him and his army back to rescue the British? A murmur rippled through the room. The Liège fortress was more than just a fortress. Capturing it meant not only the security of northeastern Belgium, but also that Charles's forces could penetrate into Germany, perhaps even outflank the German army on the western front, completely crushing them and driving them out of France. The image above is a map of Europe. The Liège fortress is located in the angle between the Netherlands and Luxembourg, opening a gap in the German defenses. Once Charles captures Liège and opens this gap, armored forces can bypass Luxembourg to the south and attack the German lines from the rear, thus ending the war. Gallieni then had his men distribute a map and possible attack routes. Armand also held a map, exclaiming dramatically, "Aha! Look, we can indeed defeat the Germans, defeat them without British help." The main German force is currently attacking the British expeditionary force along the Somme, while Charles, after recapturing the Liège fortress, will immediately circle around to the German rear. Then, all the Germans will be surrounded by us, including the Somme. He then proudly waved the map in his hand and said to the members of Parliament, Now, gentlemen, you choose one, save the British, or defeat the Germans. The room fell silent. From the perspective of French national interests, the latter was the obvious choice. Saving the British would not benefit France. In fact, it would be detrimental in principle. The best outcome would be for the Germans and British to weaken each other, allowing Charles to reap the benefits and lead the French army to a decisive end to the war. However, this would not be in the interests of Briand, the members of Parliament, or the French capitalists. It would cause Charles's prestige to soar uncontrollably. All French citizens would then elect Charles as their prime minister, and all members of Parliament could potentially be replaced by Charles's supporters through the public vote. The Bernard Group would then naturally develop into a French behemoth, unmatched by any other. However, they could not deny Gallieni's plan. this possibility, especially since the architect was the invincible Charles. After a long pause, someone asked hesitantly, then, what about our supplies? We all know that France's supplies come from British loans. Armand tossed her long, slick-back hair with a charming smile, leaning towards the questioner. You're right, Mr. Raphael, we do need supplies. However, have you considered that Charles can also buy supplies from America? He even has a fleet escort. Furthermore, if we can defeat Germany quickly, we won't need as many supplies, don't you think? The room fell silent again. Some members of Parliament turned pale with fright, as if the end of the world had come. Chapter 687 The Deception Set Up by Charles. In the hall, only Brian remained calm. He knew the state of Parliament. Many members had been bribed by the British or even the Germans. Once the battle plan was announced in Parliament, it wouldn't be a secret to the Germans. However, Brian faced a dilemma. He couldn't use this to negate Gallieni's plan, yet his military knowledge wasn't sufficient to find flaws. After a moment's thought, Brian believed he had found a breakthrough. He took the map, walked to the podium, and looked up at Gallieni, asking, Your Excellency, the focus of this plan is the capture of the Liège fortress, isn't it? Yes, Gallieni nodded. Everything was based on the capture of the Liège fortress. But as far as I know, the Germans have already repaired 80% of the Liège fortress, Brian asked again. Furthermore, the Germans have laid a large number of mines, barbed wire, and anti-tank ditches outside the Liège fortress. How can the Charles possibly capture it? This question alerted the senators, who immediately chimed in, all agreeing, yes, the Germans have been fortifying the Liège fortress for nearly 2 years. It has massive fortifications and large-caliber artillery. At the same time, it's situated between the Ardennes forest and Holland, with no other route to bypass it. A direct assault is the only option. Not only that, I've heard that the Germans have also added several artillery divisions there and stockpiled a large amount of ammunition. Some senators with even a rudimentary understanding of military matters shouted, the Charles armored forces are not suited for attacking such a fortress. They will be blown to pieces by German artillery fire. If the Charles couldn't breach the Liège fortress, there wouldn't be this plan, and we wouldn't be able to defeat the Germans. Brian kept his eyes fixed on Gallieni and asked, General, does the Charles have a plan to attack the Liège fortress? Then he added, a hint of regret in his voice, please believe me, I very much hope he does, because no one would be unwilling to win, especially me, but I worry that if we gamble everything on attacking the Liège fortress and fail, the British expeditionary force will be routed by the enemy. The members of Parliament chimed in their agreement. We cannot place our hopes on unrealistic fantasies. Even if it's not a fantasy, this plan is still a gamble. If it fails, the Allied powers will fall apart, France will lose all support, and ultimately be defeated by Germany. Gallieni blushed and stammered, yes, of course, Charles has a plan to attack the Liège fortress. What is it? Brian asked again. I can't say, Your Excellency, Gallieni replied. I'm sorry. It's a military secret, and I've already revealed too much. If I do, this plan may never be implemented. You only need to reveal a little, Brian pressed, just enough to convince us. Or, convince us before imposing martial law on all members of Parliament as before. That's different, Your Excellency, Gallieni replied. The Charles attack will take at least another month. We can't keep all the members of Parliament locked up for that long. Brian smiled slightly. Perhaps. The Charles doesn't even have a plan to attack the Liège fortress, the members of Parliament jeered. Brian believed the Charles had an attack plan. He even believed the Charles could capture the Liège fortress and even outflank the German lines to end the war. But Brian was certain Gallieni wouldn't reveal this plan, not even a single word. Because attacking the Liège fortress was too important, it could almost determine the outcome of the entire campaign. Brian seized upon this, reversing the tide that had initially favored Charles. Parliamentarians unanimously declared that Charles and his troops should be transferred to Dunkirk to reinforce the British. Meanwhile, public opinion even suggested that Charles's reluctance to go to Dunkirk was due to his unwillingness to relinquish his interests in Belgium. Namur Castle. Charles received a telegram from Paris, learning that Parliament was fiercely debating whether to reinforce Dunkirk, but he paid it no mind, casually tossing the telegram aside. Tigeny smiled slightly at the telegram. This is your idea? Isn't it? What? Charles feigned ignorance. The plan General Gallieni mentioned. Tigeny nodded at the telegram. Along with Steed and my father's support for you, they're doing everything they can to make others believe we have plans to attack the Liège fortress. Charles countered. Has it worked? Probably. Tigny nodded. I heard the Germans have reinforced a Liège fortress with 2 more infantry divisions. Furthermore, they're building trenches outside the fortress, seemingly preparing for its fall. The Germans have lost confidence after being defeated by Charles. Even with a seemingly impregnable fortress like the Liège fortress, they fear its breach. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Falkenhayn received word of Charles's impending attack on the Liège fortress. He immediately tense up, convening a meeting and instructing his staff. Although we don't know what methods Charles will use to capture the Liège fortress, we must not assume he can't do it. Facts have proven time and again that Charles can do it, each time under circumstances we thought impossible. Therefore, we should assume Charles can. But assuming Charles can do it comes at a high price. The German army not only has to reinforce the Liège fortress, but also build a defensive line north of it to prevent Charles from infiltrating. This is exactly what Charles wants. Only in this way can German supplies and troops be drawn towards the Liège fortress, rather than towards the strategically important Mézières behind the Somme line. At this moment, a guard stepped forward and reported, "General, Albert I is outside, let him in." Charles nodded. He knew why Albert I had come. Sure enough, Albert I entered, his face ashen, as if facing imminent disaster. "General, I want to know if you intend to leave. If Charles's troops were to return to reinforce, Belgium would be finished." Although Charles would fight back again, the Belgian people could not withstand such repeated purges. Damn the British, damn the French Parliament, they completely disregarded Belgian interests. "Yes, I have no choice but to leave, Your Majesty," Charles said calmly and firmly. "No, you cannot do this." Albert I's face instantly turned ashen. You must at least arrange for Belgium's defenses." "Of course," Charles nodded. "I will leave the 6th Army here. I know my troops are not very combat effective, but perhaps we can wait for your return," Albert I said nervously, not even fully hearing what Charles was saying. Suddenly, he realized what Charles meant and stared at him in astonishment. "What? You left the 6th Army here?" If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 688 Mézières. Albert I's face lit up with surprise, but it quickly darkened. "But if you leave the 6th Army here, how will you reinforce Dunkirk?" A second later, Albert I seemed to understand. "You plan to take the 1st Panzer Corps and the 1st Belgian Special Reconnaissance Corps, is that right?" "A very good choice, General. Believe me, the 1st Special Reconnaissance Corps was built to support the 1st Panzer Corps. They can accomplish all the tasks you assign them." Charles remained silent. He disagreed. The 1st Belgian Special Reconnaissance Corps was purely infantry, only capable of following up and filling the gaps, not coordinating, but that didn't matter. "I want you to see someone, Your Majesty," Charles said, nodding towards Tigny. Tigny understood and turned to give an order to his staff. A moment later, a young colonel entered the office and stood before Charles, saluting sharply. He even had a wound on his forehead, the bandage revealing a hint of red. Albert I glanced at the colonel, then cast a questioning look at Charles. "I don't think I know him, General." "You don't know him?" Charles gestured to the young colonel. "Let me introduce you. This is Colonel Tassigny, recently promoted to commander of the 1st Artillery Division, for annihilating German deserters in the Ardennes." Albert I suddenly understood. He had heard of that battle. Tassigny stepped forward and saluted Albert I. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Your Majesty." Albert I shook hands with Tassigny. "It's my honor, Colonel." "It was a perfect command. 2,000 men routed 5,000 enemies." "Thank you, Your Majesty." Tassigny maintained his smile. Only Charles's approval could move him. "But," Albert I asked doubtfully, "I heard you and your troops are searching for remnants of the enemy in the Ardennes." "No," Tassigny shrugged. "As you can see, we are in Namur." "We?" Albert I asked. "You mean?" "Yes, us." Tassigny nodded. "Me and my troops, the 1st Special Artillery Division." This further puzzled Albert I. "You mean, the 1st Special Artillery Division is in Namur?" Tigny laughed. "You think the tanks and Saint-Samon you see are the 1st Armored Division?" "No, Your Majesty, that's the 1st Special Artillery Division." This was a deceptive rhetoric Charles had given the Germans. Charles, Tigny, and a large number of tanks were in Namur. They naturally assumed the 1st Armored Division was there. But this was not the case. The 1st Armored Division had switched places with the 1st Artillery Division in Charleroi one night, unnoticed by the Germans. Albert, I still didn't understand. If the 1st Special Artillery Division is here, then where is the 1st Panzer Division? Did they go to reinforce Dunkirk? No. Charles shook his head. The 1st Panzer Division is in the Ardennes. Albert, I exclaimed. The Ardennes? Yes, Charles replied calmly. They will take 2 to 3 days to cross the Ardennes and attack Mézières. Albert, I was stunned, then turned his gaze to the map on the table. When he found the location of Mézières, his eyes widened instantly. Then he looked up at Charles, his face incredulous. My God, you're going to surround the entire main German force. Is this possible? Can it succeed? I mean, the armored forces crossing the Ardennes. Mézières is located at the junction of the Paris Basin and the Ardennes, a transportation hub in northeastern France. Several railways and highways pass through the city. And the Meuse River is used for water transport. There are also iron and coal mines nearby, making it an important metal smelting industrial center in northeastern France. The image above shows the location of Mézières. The red line represents the infiltration route of the 1st Charleville Panzer Corps. The place name in the image is Charleville-Mézières. During World War I, Charleville and Mézières were 2 adjacent fortified cities. After World War II, with urban expansion, the 2 cities were merged into one. Lieutenant General Nicholas, commander of the German 21st Army, established his headquarters here. This was not his wish. Mézières was more than 100 kilometers from the Somme River defense line, a veritable rear area. As Major General Irwin's former superior and the former commander of the 1st Tank Division, Lieutenant General Nicholas preferred to personally lead his men in tanks charging into the enemy trenches. However, Falkenhayn's orders extinguished his hopes. Falkenhayn put it tactfully, "You've been wounded, Lieutenant General. For your health, and also for the sake of a strategic commander, I think you're better suited to ensure the security of rear supplies. Mézières is a good place, it's a vital rear area for our army, it's important, I wouldn't entrust it to anyone else but you." Yes, Mézières was indeed very important. Almost all supplies heading north from here passed through Mézières, and it was also near coal and iron mines, which were scarce in Germany, and was itself a highly productive industrial city. However, I can't think of any danger here, Lieutenant General Nicholas complained angrily to his staff while looking at the map. The Meuse River bends in a C shape here, blocking our way, and the Ardennes Mountains are behind us. It's difficult for us to even spot an enemy here, unless they're spies. The staff could only patiently reply, "We are the strongest support on the front lines, General." In fact, the staff knew that Falkenhayn's arrangement was to hand over command to Major General Irwin. He believed that if anyone could defeat Charles, it would be Irwin without interference. Falkenhayn proved to be right. Major General Irwin achieved unprecedented victories on the Somme front. And Charles, he didn't even dare to move an inch from Namur. "General," a communications soldier reported, "the 1st Tank Division has reached Dunkirk. Major General Irwin is leading them on the offensive against the British lines." Cheers erupted in the command post. Staff officers and communications soldiers congratulated each other. "Fantastic. We are about to defeat the British. No one can save them, not even Charles, because France only has one Charles. He can't deal with us on 2 fronts." Lieutenant General Nicholas stared at the telegram in his hand, his eyes filled with complex emotions. He shouldn't be jealous of Irwin's achievements, he should be happy for this victory, he should feel honored. However, he couldn't deceive himself, he felt only bitterness. "I should be there," Lieutenant General Nicholas murmured to himself. The staff officer understood what he meant. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but ultimately remained silent. War is reality, and Lieutenant General Nicholas had to accept the fact that Major General Irwin was superior to him. Chapter 689 Forest Intersection. North of Mézières, in a corner of the Ardennes forest. One after another, camouflage trucks, their tops covered in vegetation, drove into the forest along a muddy road. As soon as they stopped under the shade of the trees, a group of German engineers rushed to unload the cargo. Mézières was a supply center and transit point. To avoid over-concentration of supplies and subsequent French bombing, the Germans had extended the road into the forest and built makeshift warehouses to ensure the safety of the supplies. At the other end, 2 German officers carefully shielded their eyes from the cold wind and lit cigarettes for each other. Finally lit, they puffed away contentedly. "I haven't had a vacation in a year, Captain," complained the bearded lieutenant. "I'm not even sure I can hold on." "You should consider yourself lucky, Lieutenant," the captain replied expressionlessly. "You've managed a year without a vacation." The lieutenant paused, then the two men chuckled nervously. A year without a vacation also meant that he had survived a year since enlisting, while many others only lived for a few days. After laughing for a while, the bearded lieutenant cursed harshly. "Fuck it, I don't even understand why we're fighting this war, SHH, the captain stopped him, glancing around. "Don't worry," the lieutenant replied, "many people say that, we're just telling the truth." The captain raised his hand to stop him, reminding him, "Listen carefully." "What's that sound?" The lieutenant listened intently, and faintly heard a crackling sound in the mountain wind, like tree branches breaking, and the roar of an engine. "Maybe other people are doing construction," the lieutenant said dismissively. "You know, our warehouse is almost full again." "Is that so?" The captain hesitated, glancing back at the passing cars, then realized the lieutenant's words made sense. This was the Ardennes region, more than 100 kilometers from the front lines. What else could they have besides their own vehicles? This was battlefield syndrome, the captain thought, because he had just come from the battlefield and hadn't yet adjusted to the peace of the rear. The two didn't take it seriously, continuing their conversation while smoking. Finally, crack, a tree as thick as a wrist was crushed, branches and leaves whipping up a gust of wind and dust that hurtled towards the two men. The captain was startled. He coughed a few times and shouted at the dust, "What's going on? Can't you see there's someone ahead?" "This is a warehouse." However, as the dust settled, a tank appeared before the captain. It had a 37mm cannon, the French flag emblazoned on its turret, and several soldiers following behind, their uniforms and helmets clearly indicating they were French. Both sides froze. The captain was the first to react, frantically reaching for his Luger pistol at his waist. But before he could even pull the trigger, several bullets flew and fell him to the ground in a pool of blood. The German engineers were instantly thrown into chaos, scattering like startled ants, searching for their rifles. But some remained rooted to the spot, staring blankly at the slowly approaching tank, seemingly unable to believe the enemy was before them. Inside the city of Mézières, Lieutenant General Nicholas was still brooding over his neglect. Suddenly, several gunshots rang out from the direction of the Ardennes Mountains to the north, followed by several explosions. "What's going on?" Lieutenant General Nicholas looked in the direction of the sound. "I'm not sure, General," the staff officer replied. "It might be the French partisans, those bastards." Lieutenant General Nicholas cursed irritably. "Send reinforcements, wipe them out, all of them." "Yes, General." The staff officer turned and relayed the order. Lieutenant General Nicholas sullenly sat back in his chair and loosened his top button. Now even the partisans were riding roughshod over him. However, before he could even settle in, the gunfire from the mountains grew increasingly intense, including the sound of St. Etienne II machine guns. Lieutenant General Nicholas frowned. The French partisans were equipped with St. Etienne II light machine guns? Even the regular French army hadn't fully adopted this machine gun. Just then, the communications soldier guarding the telephone a few meters away suddenly shouted, his voice tense, "General, tank spotted in the Ardennes." "It's a Charles A1, what?" Lieutenant General Nicholas jumped up from his chair as if pricked by a needle. "That's impossible. How could a Charles A1 appear in the rear? Could it be Charles' troops, that they've crossed the Ardennes?" A chill ran down his spine, and Lieutenant General Nicholas was terrified. He roared at the communications soldier like a madman, "Immediately, mobilize all reinforcements. We must stop them in the forest." Lieutenant General Nicholas, a former tank division commander, knew that tanks were unsuitable for mountain and forest warfare. Therefore, the best way was to keep them in the forest. Otherwise, once they entered the plains, the German nightmare would begin. However, just as Lieutenant General Nicholas hastily took his belt from the wall and fastened it, the rat-a-tat-tat of a submachine gun reached his ears. Nicholas was completely stunned. It was indeed Charles's troops, only his troops were equipped with submachine guns. These weapons were highly effective in close combat, and his idea of using the forest to hold off the French in close combat was likely doomed. Dunkirk was engulfed in flames under the cover of rain. Major General Irwin commanded his troops in a final assault on the British lines. The British attempted to use their old method to stop the German tank advance, battleship guns. But Major General Irwin had a countermeasure. He ordered his soldiers to release smoke upwind. The smoke, combined with the light rain, artillery fire, and the resulting dust, shrouded the entire coastline, including Dunkirk, in a thin veil. Seaplanes launched from the battleships circled overhead, unable to distinguish friend from foe and pinpoint bombing coordinates. At this moment, Major General Irwin ordered the tanks to charge. A fierce battle unfolded beneath the walls of Dunkirk. The British suffered heavy casualties under the tank onslaught, abandoning their positions and fleeing back into the city. Now, Major General Irwin proudly raised his head and waved his hand, his voice full of confidence. Dunkirk is ours. Go into the city and cheer, warriors. However, General, the communications officer shouted, French troops have appeared in Mézières. What? What did you say? Irwin stared at the communications officer in disbelief. Mézières? How is that possible? Charles' troops are likely to cross the Ardennes and launch a surprise attack on Mézières, the communications officer replied. Lieutenant General Nicholas has ordered you to return to reinforce immediately. Major General Irwin was stunned. At this moment, he finally understood why Charles had remained inactive. Chapter 690 The Final Expedition. Happy Lantern Festival everyone. I only had time to write one chapter today because relatives came to visit. I'll finish it tomorrow. Sorry. While the fighting raged fiercely on the front lines, a fierce battle was also unfolding in the Chamber of Deputies at the Bourbon Palace in France. The members of Parliament were launching a final attack on Charles's faction, led by Gallieni. We have no time to delay any longer. The Germans have reached Dunkirk. We must immediately order Charles to reinforce them. That's their goal. They want to drag things out until Dunkirk is captured. They are traitors to France. Charles is abusing his power to protect his own interests. He treats the army as his personal property. We cannot tolerate his reckless actions. This is shameless dictatorship. Gallieni coldly stared at the members of Parliament below, his eyes filled with contempt and anger. These members of Parliament, who constantly spoke of national interests, were actually thinking only of how to advance their own personal gain. Gallieni couldn't imagine how they had the audacity to say such things. However, Gallieni said nothing. He knew arguing with these people was pointless. He waited quietly for the outcome. At that moment, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand entered from outside. He whispered a few words in Gallieni's ear, and Gallieni smiled slightly and nodded in satisfaction. Brian walked up to the audience and stood before Gallieni. He remained composed and didn't shout like the others, believing that this would only make people think he was targeting Charles, a war hero and representative figure, thus exacerbating the conflict between Parliament and the military. He glanced at the audience and said to Gallieni with a helpless expression, I regret to inform you, Your Excellency Minister, that I believe we should respect the choice of the members of Parliament, as they represent the citizens of France. Yes, Gallieni nodded calmly. The members of Parliament have chosen to reinforce Dunkirk, Brian reminded him. I think we no longer need to vote. That would be a waste of time. What do you think? I agree, Your Excellency Prime Minister, Gallieni replied. So, a barely perceptible smile appeared on Brian's face, the smile of a victor, as he handed over a document. This is the order to reinforce Dunkirk. You only need to sign it. I think that's unnecessary, Your Excellency the Prime Minister, Gallieni interrupted Brian, his tone curt. What? Brian was taken aback, his gaze gradually turning stern, his voice carrying a hint of threat. You cannot disobey the Council's decision, Your Excellency the Minister, or I will have to dismiss you. Gallieni stared into Brian's eyes, fearless, and said, word by word, you may not know, but Charles has already won. Brian's expression changed. Charles won? What victory? He captured the Liège fortress? Impossible. Suddenly, someone pushed open the door, shouting breathlessly, his voice trembling with excitement, he won. Charles won. He captured Mézières. The room erupted in uproar. Mézières was a well-known industrial city in France. Even the members of Parliament had heard of it and owned shares in its factories. They all knew the city was behind German lines, and yet Charles had captured it. Brian was stunned. He knew Mézières. When he founded the Socialist Party, he had given speeches there more than once, going among the workers to understand their hardships. Note, Brian's Socialist Party was primarily composed of the working class. Therefore, Brian knew Mézières was a transportation hub, and even though he didn't understand military matters, he understood its importance. No, this is impossible, Brian said after a moment, shaking his head. Charles couldn't have captured Mézières. He's still in Namur, in Belgium. Even so, a sense of unease lingered in Brian's heart. That was Charles. For Charles, nothing was impossible. The members of Parliament, jolted awake by Brian's remark, chimed in. Yes, Charles is in Belgium, separated from Mézières by the Ardennes. How did he capture it? Did he fly there? I see, you're trying to use this false information to buy time, to avoid reinforcing Dunkirk. Gallieni ignored the hesitant Brian. He stood tall at the front of the table, a confident smile on his face. Gentlemen, you're right, Belgium is separated from Mézières by the Ardennes, but you've forgotten that Charles has already captured Charleroi. While we were debating whether to reinforce Dunkirk, Charles's first armored corps had already crossed the Ardennes and arrived in Mézières. The meeting room erupted in another uproar. Armored troops crossing the Ardennes, was that really possible? Even Wells and Steed were stunned. They had only cooperated with Gallieni to prevent Parliament from passing the resolution and were unaware of the detailed plan. They had assumed Charles was indeed protecting his interests in Belgium, but now it seemed that wasn't the case. Armand smiled indifferently. He didn't care whether the Germans, the French, or the British won, it didn't matter much to him. He was only certain of one thing, Charles was the undisputed leader, and no one could challenge his position in the future. Therefore, following Charles was undoubtedly the right choice. Gallieni wasn't in a hurry. He waited for the members of Parliament to discuss it for a while before adding, to know if this is true, you only need to see the Germans' reaction. Many members of Parliament, completely ignorant of military matters, blurted out without thinking, what will the Germans' reaction be? Do we have to ask the Germans if this is true? Gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand couldn't help but interject, if Charles really captures Mézières, the German attack on Dunkirk will be meaningless. Because Charles has surrounded the Germans from the rear, including Dunkirk, the members of Parliament then understood, so, the Germans will retreat. What will happen if they don't retreat? If they don't retreat, they will only die, because they won't get more ammunition and reinforcements. Just then, someone pushed open the door and shouted, the Germans have retreated. Dunkirk is safe. We have won. There were no cheers, no applause. The meeting room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then, someone started it, and a few scattered claps rang out. Soon more and more people joined in, and applause quickly erupted, even from those members of Parliament who didn't want Charles to win. Charles' victory wasn't good news for them, but they still couldn't help but express their heartfelt admiration for his performance. Gallieni turned to look at Brian, glancing at the documents in his hand. Your Excellency, do I need to sign this? Brian suddenly realized, oh, no, of course not, that's clearly unnecessary. Chapter 691 I was tricked by Charles again. The battle at Mézières was almost entirely one-sided. Lieutenant General Nicholas's attempt to hold back the French tank forces in the forest had completely failed. This was partly due to weaponry. The 1st Panzer Corps was equipped with numerous Saint-Étienne II light machine guns and submachine guns, well suited for close-quarters combat in the jungle. However, the real reason for the German rout was not this, but rather the thousands of engineers busy clearing warehouses and unloading goods in the Ardennes. They were immediately terrified by the tanks and fled in disarray, many without weapons, let alone the ability to retaliate. This left the arriving regular troops overwhelmed by the sheer number of people, unable to distinguish friend from foe. The fleeing vehicles darted about, some crashing into trees and throwing drivers and shattered windows, others igniting their fuel tanks and continuing to accelerate, and still others running over their comrades before finally breaking through the German lines. The forest was in complete chaos. The panicked shouts and screams even drowned out the sounds of tank engines and gunfire. Before Lieutenant General Nicholas and his reinforcements even reached their destination, they saw a dark mass of fleeing German soldiers emerging from the edge of the forest. Gunfire and explosions echoed through the dense woods behind them, occasionally punctuated by bursts of flame. Had it not been for the dampness of the forest after winter, a forest fire would likely have broken out. Soon, tanks slowly emerged from the forest, each followed by a squad of French soldiers who relentlessly fired, mowing down the fleeing Germans like target practice. The tanks, like tigers freed from their cages, accelerated, pursuing the fleeing soldiers. Lieutenant General Nicholas realized his plan had failed. The forest couldn't stop the enemy. He decisively ordered, retreat. Retreat back into the city and establish a defensive line. Calmly, Lieutenant General Nicholas told himself that tanks were also unsuitable for fighting within the city. On the way back to the city, he had already decided, he should disperse his troops into residential buildings and prepare grenades and explosives to destroy the tanks. The French army would be hesitant to act for a fear of accidentally harming civilians, easily leading to a stalemate and a war of attrition. This would be advantageous to the Germans. However, Lieutenant General Nicholas overlooked one crucial point: Mézières was a French city, home to many guerrilla groups, and civilians would seize the opportunity to revolt upon hearing the gunfire. As a result, before even returning to the city, Lieutenant General Nicholas discovered that the city was engulfed in gunfire and smoke. "What's going on?" Lieutenant General Nicholas asked, a sense of foreboding creeping in. "General," the communications officer reported, "it's the guerrillas, and a civilian uprising. They've set their own houses on fire, hoping to spread the flames to our camps and warehouses." Lieutenant General Nicholas was stunned. This was indeed a clever and easily executed method to overwhelm the Germans. After a moment of hesitation, Nicholas hastily ordered, "The train station. Secure the train station." The train station stored a large amount of supplies, including munitions and gasoline destined for the front lines. If these fell into enemy hands, they would become enemy supplies. But it was all too late. The communications officer reported, his eyes filled with terror, "General, the partisans have captured the train station." Lieutenant General Nicholas's vision blurred. It was all over. The French had everything they needed. "Your orders, General." The staff officer glanced panicked towards the forest. French tanks were closing in on them. Lieutenant General Nicholas glanced back at the pursuing troops, a look of helplessness on his face. "Abandon the city, cross the river, and establish a defensive line along the river." "Yes, General." Under Lieutenant General Nicholas's leadership, the German troops crossed the Meuse River and blew up the bridge. Only then did they finally get a brief respite. On the opposite bank, the civilians of Mézières cheered as the French army entered the city. When they heard that the unit was Charles's 1st Panzer Corps, they were overjoyed. "My God, it's Charles's unit, the 1st Panzer Corps. They actually crossed the Ardennes? How did they do that?" "Because it's Charles's unit. Charles can do things that others can't even imagine, so we're safe." Unbelievable. This isn't a transition, it's liberation, complete liberation. Many civilians worried that the French offensive was just a small-scale attack, and that they would hastily retreat after capturing the area. After all, this was the heart of German-controlled territory. But knowing that it was Charles's 1st Panzer Corps that had come, they were convinced that the Germans would completely lose control of Mézières. Because Charles's troops had never lost a battle, nor had they ever given up any recaptured territory. This was Charles's influence. Wherever he went, he brought morale and confidence to the military and civilians. Wilhelmstrasse, Berlin, German General Staff. When the intelligence reached Falkenhayn's desk, he was almost stunned, frozen in his chair for a full 2 minutes, unable to react. Startled awake by Colonel Moritz's call, he asked with an incredulous expression, "Why is Charles's armored corps in Mézières? Wasn't it always in Namur?" "General, we might have been fooled by Charles," Colonel Moritz said, a hint of embarrassment in his eyes. "Again, what do you mean?" Falkenhayn still didn't understand. Fearing a Charles attack on the Liège fortress, his spies and informants had been constantly monitoring Charles's forces. Colonel Moritz, referring to the map, said, "Charles's attack on the Liège fortress is just a pretext. Their real purpose is to keep us watching it. Charles's 1st Armored Corps isn't in Namur either. What's in Namur is likely the 1st Special Artillery Division of the 6th Army." Falkenhayn felt a wave of dizziness. That bastard Charles had fooled him again, and so thoroughly. Composing himself, Falkenhayn hysterically issued 2 orders: withdraw all troops, all of them, as quickly as possible from the encirclement, send reinforcements. We must blockade the Charles forces in Mézières, at all costs. The Allies could not withstand another large-scale encirclement and annihilation, especially since at least 400,000 troops were trapped in the encirclement. If they were surrounded and surrendered by the Charles, the battle would end with the collapse of the Allies. At this moment, a communications soldier reported, "General, Charles bombers have taken off from Charleroi. They are flying over the Ardennes and bombing the railways and roads near Mézières. It will be difficult for our troops to reach reinforcements." Falkenhayn frowned helplessly and closed his eyes, seemingly unwilling and unable to face this dire situation. He realized one thing: even if the main force managed to break out successfully, the Charles would have ruthlessly ravaged them. Chapter 692. He's our role model. Paris, France. Citizens received information a little late. News of the fighting that occurred in the morning didn't spread until the afternoon. To be precise, it didn't spread in the afternoon. The news began to circulate intermittently after Parliament closed at noon. However, when it first broke, citizens generally didn't believe it. They thought it was a rumor because it was hard to believe, Charles' troops are in Belgium. How could they suddenly be in Mézières? I heard they not only reached Mézières, but they also successfully occupied it. That's a fortified city, nestled in the Meuse River with its rear facing the Ardennes. Is this fake news from the government? To appease the citizens. It's understandable that citizens thought this way. The government often exaggerated victories while keeping defeats secret. The government believed this would reassure citizens to work and make them feel that hard work was worthwhile, rather than causing them to lose confidence and go on strike. Of course, many dissenting voices were mixed in. Charles is only thinking about his own interests in Belgium. He didn't even reinforce Dunkirk. How could he possibly attack Mézières? To attack Mézières, should we break through the German lines from the Mons direction? Yes, suddenly appearing in Mézières is a joke, impossible, a deliberately fabricated lie. These were mostly people bought off by capitalists, mainly from the Schneider Electric Company. They believed that the best and cheapest way to defeat Charles was to create negative public opinion. And now was a perfect opportunity. As long as Charles didn't reinforce Dunkirk, it could be said that he was for his own selfish reasons. Even if Charles eventually reinforced Dunkirk and even won, it could be said that it was a choice Charles made out of desperation, that he was not doing it for the country but for achieving dictatorship. Once this consensus was formed among the citizens, even lies could easily bring Charles down. Until after 2 p.m., the newspaper Honorable published a supplement, which included a photo of French tanks entering Mézières. The newspapers included a few brief, official footnotes, devoid of any emotion, as if reporting something trivial. At 9:10, the 1st Panzer Corps of the Charles successfully crossed the Ardennes and arrived at Mézières. At 10:05, the 1st Panzer Corps smoothly entered the city of Mézières, and with the help of the city's citizens, successfully gained control. At 10:30, the German 1st Tank Division besieging Dunkirk began its retreat. The crisis at Dunkirk has been lifted. This was Cobdeau's tactic. He believed that the more understated the reporting at this time, the more sensational it would be. Because, no amount of flowery language can describe the greatness of this victory. As soon as the newspapers appeared, those secretly creating negative publicity fell silent. They had considered various scenarios, even contemplating a Charles attack on the Liège fortress, but they hadn't anticipated that Charles's troops would appear at Mézières and decisively win the battle. What could they say now? That the Charles refused to reinforce Dunkirk for his own selfish interests? His attack on Mézières had already relieved the siege of Dunkirk, so there was no need for reinforcements. To say that Charles was pursuing his own dictatorship? Mézières' campaign was clearly pre-planned. First capture Charleroi, then build roads and bridges in the Ardennes, and finally deliver a decisive blow. In other words, Charles was preparing from the very beginning of the British Army's collapse, not disregarding his allies for his own interests and power. What truly astonished the rumor-mongers and their backers was their assumption that Charles would ultimately be forced to reinforce Dunkirk, sacrificing Belgian interests. Because rescuing Dunkirk would require taking all troops, which would lead to Belgium's reoccupation by Germany. However, Charles effortlessly defused this predicament. The 6th Army remained in Namur to deter the Germans from attacking Belgium. The 1st Panzer Corps penetrated from the Ardennes to Mézières to relieve the siege of Dunkirk. A win-win situation. In fact, more than a win-win situation. With this victory, Charles shattered all the negative public opinions surrounding him and further solidified his social prestige. Paris went wild for Charles's victory once again. The moment the news broke in the newspapers, those who managed to grab a copy ran around frantically spreading the word. As the newspaper Le Monde sold out, the citizens were ecstatic. Those doing housework at home, those walking in the streets, even those working in factories, everyone poured into the streets cheering. Many jumped and shouted, "Mézières, we have recaptured Mézières, Charles is our eternal hero, Charles is the savior of France, he is the savior of all of us." Compared to the excitement in Paris, the town of Darriaz was rather quiet. The news was spread by Fabio, the newspaper delivery man. His mode of transportation was originally a horse-drawn carriage, and his daily job was to travel between Paris and Darriaz to bring the day's newspaper to the town. Perhaps because Darriaz was Charles's hometown, the government provided Fabio with a car and a novice driver, Frederick. That day, Fabio drove into Darriaz, honking his horn and shouting wildly, "Charles has won. Charles has recaptured Mézières. Charles has saved France once again." However, the neighbors in the town of Darriaz reacted indifferently. They merely glanced in Fabio's direction, smiled, and said to those around them, "Oh, Charles has won again." The others replied, "Yes, he's always winning, that's great," and that was it. They went back to their business, planning to buy a newspaper later to read the details. They had no concept of Mézières, no idea what this battle meant, and no idea how difficult it would be for the armored forces to cross the Ardennes. As for Charles' victories, they were already used to them. As the car passed Djoka's hut, Fabio yelled, "Stop! Stop! You idiot, this is Charles' house." Fidel slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to halt. Before the car had even come to a complete stop, Fabio jumped out, waving a newspaper as he ran towards Camille, who was coming to greet him. His voice was excited and his face beaming. "Mrs. Bernard, would you like one? Charles has won again, a magnificent victory, of course," Camille replied with a happy and proud smile, taking the newspaper and offering the money. Fabio refused. "No, Mrs. Bernard, this is for you." Camille insisted on paying, but Fabio quickly ran off, leaping back into the car. As the car started moving again, he removed his baseball cap. "Salute to you, Mrs. Bernard. You have an excellent son, he's our role model." Chapter 693 C-shaped encirclement. However, the 1st Panzer Division's offensive was neither as easy nor as successful as it appeared to outsiders. The destruction of the Meuse River Bridge by the Germans hampered Charles's subsequent advance. At Mézières Airport, Major General Brown, commander of the 1st Panzer Division, personally led a force to occupy and clear the area, then deployed a tank company and an infantry battalion for protection. Major General Brown glanced at his watch, and as he looked up, he heard the roar of aircraft in the setting sun. Soon, a formation of planes came into view. The planes separated in the air, Camel fighters circled overhead, while 2 Avro biplanes, protected in the middle, descended and finally landed on the runway. Charles and Tejani disembarked. As Charles jumped out of the plane, he looked around, feeling a sense of unreality. He had painstakingly planned for over half a month, even starting preparations a month in advance, and the capture of Mézières seemed so close. However, Charles immediately understood what was going on. The Ardennes Mountains separated Mézières and Charleroi, making it extremely difficult for armored forces to cross, while air travel was a direct route, covering only 30-odd kilometers before they were off the plain. Major General Brownie approached with his guards. "General, you could actually command from Namur, is that so?" Charles retorted expressionlessly. "Where's Major General Estini? And what about the Meuse River Bridge? Why was it destroyed?" Major General Brownie was speechless. This incursion into the Ardennes had encountered many unexpected events. The original plan was to split into 2 groups before crossing the Ardennes, one heading straight for Mézières and the other crossing the Meuse River downstream to seize the Meuse River Bridge. The red line in the image above indicates the marching direction, and the light blue curve on the map represents the course of the Meuse River, which flows from south to north through the Ardennes. This is why Mézières is extremely prone to flooding. The river narrows as it flows into the Ardennes, making it difficult to discharge floodwaters, and increased upstream water levels can easily cause flooding in Mézières. The image above shows Mézières during the 1995 floods. In Charles's plan, Colonel Estini's mechanized regiment was supposed to reach the west bank of the Meuse and capture the undefended Meuse Bridge. This would not only give them control of the bridge, a vital transportation route, but also cut off the German retreat from the rear. However, Colonel Estini's troops got lost and have not yet arrived. Meanwhile, Major General Brown's main force unexpectedly encountered the enemy in the Ardennes, forcing them into battle. This led to the current situation. The Germans fled to the west bank of the Meuse, then destroyed the bridge, blocking the advance of the 1st Panzer Corps. Brownie led Charles into the airport terminal, where a well-furnished office was located. This had originally been a German Air Force base, but because it was too close to Charleroi, all the planes had been evacuated 2 weeks prior. Brownie looked at Charles, who sat at his desk exuding an air of authority, and felt a pang of emotion. A year ago, when he had grabbed Charles's bicycle in Darvaz and made him lead the way, Charles was still a naive boy. Now, he had grown into a general renowned throughout the world, capable of effortlessly destroying a nation. Thinking this, a smile unconsciously crept onto Brownie's lips. Charles, oblivious to Brownie's change in expression, continued studying the map and asked in a low voice, "Where is Colonel Estini now?" "Unsure, General," Major General Brownie replied, locating a spot on the map. "Perhaps here." The terrain became extremely complex after marching west. Colonel Estini encountered an insurmountable ravine. He attempted to bypass it, but ended up getting lost. This was due to the lack of proper paving for the latter part of the route. The latter half of the route was very close to the German lines. If the scouts and engineers continued building roads and bridges as before, they would easily be discovered by the enemy, thus revealing their strategic intentions. Charles asked again, "When will they arrive?" "At the latest, tomorrow," Major General Brown explained. "It's almost dark, and marching at night is dangerous and slower." Charles frowned. "What about the enemy? What's their situation?" "The enemy has amassed at least 3 infantry divisions," Brown said, pointing to the Meuse River on the map. "They've deployed along the river bank, clearly hoping to keep us trapped inside Mézières." While Mézières was easy to defend and difficult to attack, it was also difficult to breach. The Meuse River formed a C-shaped semi-encirclement around the city. If the Germans blew up the bridges and deployed their troops along the river, they could easily surround the 1st Panzer Corps within the city. Tigeny interjected, "Even if Estini's troops return tomorrow, it won't be of any use." Charles nodded in agreement. Realizing they were surrounded, the German troops were steadily retreating from the front lines, and reinforcements were arriving from the south. Although their movements were slowed by bomber harassment, gathering 4 to 5 divisions by tomorrow wouldn't be a problem. Estini's forces, however, consisted of only a mechanized regiment of a little over 2,000 men, insufficient to significantly impact the West Bank. In fact, they were likely to be encircled and annihilated by the Germans. "Order Estini," Charles ordered, "when he arrives tomorrow, continue to remain concealed and do not make any rash moves." "Yes, General," the staff officer responded and went to relay the order. Silence fell over the command post. The atmosphere was somewhat awkward. Brownie felt guilty for botching the plan. Tigeny, however, acted as if nothing was wrong, making himself coffee and then making a cup each for Charles and Brownie. As he served Charles coffee, he looked relaxed. "Please, Lieutenant General, things are already much better. We've captured this place and cut off the German supply lines, forcing them to retreat. We've achieved our strategic objectives. What more do you want? We could have surrounded many German troops, perhaps even more." Charles's voice held a hint of regret. Tigeny laughed, but said nothing, merely raising his coffee cup slightly before continuing to drink. His expression seemed to say, "Greed knows no bounds, that's enough." This was Tigeny's character. As a rich second generation, he didn't have high expectations for anything. Success was enough, and minor setbacks weren't a big deal. This mentality might seem good in life, but it was unacceptable on the battlefield. "This is war, Major General," Charles reminded him. "On the battlefield, you must seize every possible opportunity to expand your gains. Otherwise, the enemy you let go today could very well defeat you or even kill you tomorrow." Tigeny paused, then his expression gradually turned serious after a moment of consideration. "That's right, Lieutenant General," Tigeny nodded. "Excellent war philosophy," but then he gestured with his chin toward the Meuse River on the map. "But we don't seem to have a way to deal with it. It's a pity we didn't bring amphibious assault ships and landing craft, otherwise there might still be hope." Chapter 694 Mézières Dilemma. "We can land at a different location," Major General Brown suggested. "There's another bridge about 7 kilometers upstream. The Germans are definitely prepared." Charles rejected the idea. Destroying or blocking a bridge with fire wouldn't be difficult. All it would take is some explosives or a battalion of artillery. Tigeny helplessly shrugged. "Like I said, let's hold this position." Suddenly, the whistling of artillery shells filled the air, followed by dozens of shells exploding in the city. This caused panic among the city's inhabitants. Shouts and screams filled the air, interspersed with faint cries of agony and weeping. Charles and his men stood by the window, looking out. The shells continued to rain down on the city. Before long, Mézières, which had been celebrating moments before, was filled with smoke and fire, and several places were ablaze. Charles gazed at the flames of war outside, and said thoughtfully, "So, you still think we can achieve final victory by staying here?" "What?" Tigeny looked puzzled, then suddenly understood. "You mean the German shelling is a counter-offensive?" No, they still can't get to here, not a counter-offensive, Major General," Charles replied. "If they can encircle us in Mézières, they might even be able to hold the line north of Mézières." "But Mézières is a vital transportation hub," Tigeny replied. "Indeed," Charles replied, "but they can build a railway around Mézières. It won't take much time." Charles then added, "At the same time, They can continuously bombard civilians to create panic, while the German army is gathering more and more on the west bank of the Meuse. At this rate, how long do you think we can hold out? Tigny fell silent. Although the French had captured a lot of supplies that could meet their needs for a while, the Germans, with their increased artillery fire, could easily bombard the city to smithereens. Charles ordered in a deep voice, "Move the personnel and supplies to the Ardennes." "Yes, General." The staff officer turned and went to make the arrangements. Soon, the people of Mézières began to move their families to the northern mountains, and soldiers and vehicles continuously dispersed supplies from the train station. If it weren't for Charles's continuous harassment of the German forces with bombers, the train station would probably have been bombed to the ground by now. However, this did not mean that Mézières was safe. As night fell, Charles, Tigny, and Brownie discussed the river crossing plan under the lamplight while looking at a map. A communications soldier stepped forward and reported, "General, German reinforcements have arrived in Sedan, estimated to be an infantry division." Charles and the others exchanged glances, while seeing worry in each other's eyes. Sedan was on the same side of the Meuse River. Once the Germans built up fortifications there, the 1st Panzer Corps would be surrounded and unable to go anywhere but stay there and be bombed. "If this continues, we may have no choice but to turn back," Brownie said. "Or, we could launch a preemptive attack on Sedan," Tigny suggested. "I mean, while the Germans are still establishing themselves, they won't be able to stop our advance." "But what's the point?" Brownie objected. "And once our main force attacks Sedan, the Germans will cross the river and attack Mézières. If we lose Mézières too, we won't even be able to retreat. Then what can we do?" Tigny asked anxiously. "Are we really going to retreat?" Brownie remained silent. He felt this seemed to be the only option. The Germans didn't need to capture Mézières, they just needed to bombard it into ruins. Silence fell over the command post. After a long while, Charles sighed softly. "It seems we have no choice but to take a risk." "Take a risk?" Brownie and Tigny looked at Charles simultaneously. So, there was still a way. On the west bank of the Meuse River, a disheveled Lieutenant General Nicholas hid in a newly constructed semi-buried fortification, staring at the yellowed map under the oil lamp. He was constantly thankful that he had retreated to the west bank of the Meuse River in time and destroyed the bridge, otherwise, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Lieutenant General Nicholas remained silent, his brow furrowed, until his staff reported that the 107th Infantry Division had reinforced Sedan, at which point he secretly breathed a sigh of relief. "It's clear that Charles is also helpless in this situation," Lieutenant General Nicholas analyzed to his staff. "His tactics prioritize speed. Once he's blocked by our forces and unable to advance smoothly, he's nothing to fear." "Yes, General," the staff agreed. "This isn't Charles's forte in positional warfare, especially since his armored forces are trapped in the city where they can't deploy." Lieutenant General Nicholas nodded slightly. He suddenly realized that he seemed to have stumbled upon a blessing in disguise. Before this, Irwin and his 1st Tank Division had stolen the limelight. Now, if he could defeat Charles's 1st Panzer Corps here, he would not only be able to vent his anger but also overturn Falkenhayn's opinion of him. Thinking of this, Lieutenant General Nicholas, who had been exhausted, regained his energy. He turned his gaze back to the map and ordered in a deep voice, "Immediately transport a batch of ammunition from the rear under cover of darkness, along with artillery. Bring all the artillery in the vicinity here. Also, withdraw the 96th Infantry Division and send it to Sedan. Send out communications troops and move all the troops withdrawn from the front lines here to garrison." Lieutenant General Nicholas's assessment was, the defenses on the west bank of the Meuse River were basically secure, and the Charles had no means of crossing the river. The most dangerous place at this moment was Sedan, where an infantry division might not be able to withstand the Charles's attack. Therefore, he was transferring an infantry division from the riverbank defenses to reinforce Sedan. As for the gaps in the riverbank defenses, they could be filled with troops withdrawn from the front lines. This idea seemed fine on the surface, but what Lieutenant General Nicholas didn't realize was that this precisely left the Charles with a rare opportunity to break through. The sky was vast and the stars twinkled. The northern section of the C-shaped encirclement of Mézières lay on the banks of the Meuse River, near the Ardennes region. Originally stationed there was the German 96th Infantry Division, who spent several hours constructing fortifications. This was no easy task given the terrain, where the river had overflowed its banks and even flooded houses. They had to build trenches with sandbags, shivering in the icy water while sheltering in their fortifications, constantly monitoring the rising water and ensuring their ammunition didn't get damp. Therefore, they felt a sense of relief when they heard they were being transferred to Seychelles. The soldiers offered their blessings to the arriving engineers. "The line is yours now. We've built the fortifications, you're welcome, enjoy it. I think the most important thing is to make sure you don't freeze to death before the enemy arrives. Sorry, there's nowhere to sleep here, because the ground is flooded. You'd better stay standing all night." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 695 Amphibious Tank. The 52nd Engineer Regiment, with only a little over 2,000 men, relieved the 96th Infantry Division. This resulted in a severely insufficient firepower density on the defensive line, averaging only about 2 rounds per meter per minute. Note, normally, firepower density should reach more than 10 rounds per meter per minute. In World War I, this relied on sheer numbers, while in modern times it relies on automated equipment. However, Lieutenant General Nicholas didn't see anything wrong with this. Charles' troops have almost no chance of crossing the river, Lieutenant General Nicholas analyzed, pointing to the Meuse River on the map. It's currently the snowmelt season, and the river is swollen. The water level has already overflowed the banks for a full 2 kilometers. Even if Charles risked building a bridge to cross, they couldn't possibly complete it in a short time. Therefore, as long as someone is stationed there, firing warning shots when anything unusual is detected, that will be enough. The staff officer also thought this idea was sound. The river was a natural barrier, an insurmountable obstacle. Charles couldn't possibly appear suddenly and successfully land before the German reinforcements arrived. Thus, Lieutenant General Nicholas's order was carried out. At the German 52nd Engineer Regiment's position, soldiers shivered in knee-deep river water, clutching their rifles. It was torture. They dared not stand upright, fearing they would become targets of enemy fire. Yet they dared not crouch, for the ground was flooded. All they could do was move a stool to sit on to keep their upper bodies dry. Even so, their feet remained submerged in the icy water. Lieutenant Jeremy was particularly unlucky. While inspecting the lines, he tripped over a branch in the water and became soaked. He could only retreat to an abandoned hut to wring out his clothes, which made him feel a little better. "You should change your clothes, Lieutenant," his guard said to Lieutenant Jeremy. Lieutenant Jeremy replied helplessly, "I put my backpack on a chair when I came, and guess what happened? By the time I returned, the water had risen, and it was floating right in front of me." Rivers can be magical sometimes. You think they won't change, but suddenly they rise higher than you could imagine. The guard suggested, "Then you should build a fire to dry your clothes, otherwise you might not make it to dawn." Lieutenant Jeremiah refused without hesitation. "That would only give them a target. Their artillery fire would blow me to bits." Saying this, he hung another set of clothes outside to dry, hoping it would be dry by daybreak. Then, shivering inside, he lit a cigarette and greedily puffed on it, finding a sliver of warmth. Having endured the entire night, Lieutenant Jeremiah was thankful he hadn't frozen to death. Dawn gradually broke, and a ray of sunlight pierced the gray sky, piercing the thick fog over the river and bringing a touch of warmth to the world. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The cold night was finally coming to an end. But no one spoke. They looked up at the sunlight, hoping it would quickly merge. Just then, Lieutenant Jeremiah heard an unusual sound amidst the artillery fire, coming from the center of the river. Jeremiah looked towards the river in confusion, but all he could see was a white blur. At first, Jeremiah thought he had misheard, but the sound grew louder and clearer. And the soldiers noticed it too, turning their puzzled gazes towards the river. "Alarm!" Jeremiah shouted, issuing the order, "Enemy attack! Prepare for battle." The soldiers tensed, ignoring their soaked trousers, kneeling and aiming their rifles at the river, their eyes scanning the mist with bated breath. Closer, closer still. It was clearly the sound of propellers striking the water, and oars. Lieutenant Jeremiah wondered, would Charles be foolish enough to risk a forced crossing? With fishing boats, wooden boats? It was almost impossible. They would be used as targets and wiped out in the middle of the river, their bodies washed away by the icy water. Suddenly, a square white cloth appeared before them, almost invisible from 300 meters away, blending into the mist. Then another appeared, and so on, covering the riverbed in a dense, overwhelming mass. "Fire!" Lieutenant Jeremiah shouted the order. Bang! Bang! Rat-a-tat-tat, dot. Rifles and machine guns fired in unison, but the blows barely registered on the white cloth formations. They merely swayed a few times, their speed undiminished, continuing their slow advance towards the German coastal defenses. "What's that?" a German soldier exclaimed. "Is it Charles's new equipment? Our weapons are completely ineffective against it." Lieutenant Jeremiah remained calm. He loudly ordered the communications officer, "Artillery, contact the artillery immediately," but it was too late to contact the artillery, as the square cloth formations had already reached within 100 meters of the defensive line. Then, with a whoosh, they started up, the roar of a tank engine. In fact, they were tanks, as several had already driven onto the shallows, revealing their tracks and chassis. Some even fired a shot after coming to a stop, piercing through the fortifications and revealing the turrets hidden within. At that moment, the German troops were terrified. "God, their tanks can drive in water, their tanks have crossed the river, how can we stop these monsters?" The image above shows an amphibious tank modified from the Sherman by the U.S. military during World War II, model Sherman DD. Its structure was very simple, consisting of a buoy-like enclosure around its body that allowed it to float, driven by two external propellers below. The image above shows the enclosure when retracted. Tanks successfully landed, completely unaffected by German weapons. Bullets hitting their armor produced only a series of clanging sounds without any impact. Several tanks were stuck in the mud and unable to move. This was the risk Charles had worried about. The road surface, submerged in the river, might not be able to support the weight of the tanks. However, because the water level had overflowed the riverbanks, the tanks that had successfully reached the shore were not in danger and could still rotate their turrets to fire at the German troops with their 37mm cannons or machine guns. Behind them, squads of French soldiers followed in wooden boats and rubber dinghies. The long-absent German artillery fire finally broke out, shells exploding in the river, sending towering columns of water flying and tearing several wooden boats to shreds. But this changed nothing. Charles's biggest fear was that the tanks would be bombarded while in the river. These amphibious tanks, buoyed by their canopies, were extremely vulnerable. A single wave could sink them to the bottom. They clearly couldn't withstand artillery fire, even if the shells didn't hit them. Fortunately, none of this happened. The tanks successfully reached the shore and covered the infantry as they opened a breach in the defensive line. Their next task was to advance directly towards the German artillery positions behind the lines. Chapter 696. The amphibious tank was a last-minute solution that Charles came up with. When Charles presented the sketches to Tidjany and Brownie, they were both stunned by his idea. "This is insane," Tidjany exclaimed, eyes wide. "You're planning to make such simple modifications and throw the tank into the water? And expect it to cross the river? You forgot it weighs 7 tons, General." Charles raised an eyebrow. 7 tons was nothing. The Americans used a 33.65-ton Sherman tank with this plan. Major General Brownie had long since developed a habit of unconditionally trusting Charles, but even he couldn't believe it when he heard the plan. "Are you sure this is feasible, General? Or, let's wait for Colonel Stenny's troops. I mean, if we're pinning our hopes on amphibious tanks, we might as well attack with Colonel Stenny." This argument had some merit. The amphibious tanks were a surprise attack, as were Colonel Stenny's troops, and Colonel Stenny's mechanized regiment was also equipped with tanks. Clearly, the latter was safer. But Charles shook his head, rejecting the suggestion. "We don't have time, Major General. The chances of Colonel Stenny arriving and engaging in battle by tomorrow morning are extremely slim, and if we lose this crucial attack point tomorrow morning, we may never have another chance." Tidjany agreed. "The Lieutenant General is right. The German troops retreating are assembling in large numbers on the other side of the river. It's slower to assemble and deploy at night now. Once it's light, troops will arrive continuously and reinforce the riverbank defenses. Therefore, there's only one chance tomorrow morning." Brownie fell silent. He had just contacted Stenny, and he was even hesitant to march in the dark, as it was easy to lose his way again. So Charles was right. The possibility of the mechanized regiment arriving by dawn was almost zero, and not only that, whether they could even arrive by tomorrow was questionable. "We have no other choice." Tidjany picked up the sketch Charles had drawn from the table and waved it, his eyes filled with helplessness. "We can only try this thing, even though it looks—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Not very reliable." Tidjany knew that morale was crucial for the troops. If even the commander lacked confidence in this equipment, how could the soldiers trust it and use it to win battles? Therefore, from this moment on, Tidjany was determined to trust this equipment without reservation. Major General Brownie considered for a while and finally nodded in agreement. However, he took out his pocket watch and looked at it, his tone worried. It's already past 8 o'clock. There are only about 10 hours until dawn tomorrow. Will we make it in time? Tidjany laughed. You forgot this is Mizir, Major General. There's even a shipyard here. The above picture shows the Meuse River, most of which is navigable and is one of the more important waterways in Europe. The shipyard Tidjany knew was Charles Shipyard, which had previously had technical exchanges with Brest Shipyard, and Wells even owned a 10% stake. The difference was that Charles Shipyard specialized in inland river shipbuilding, such as small cargo ships, yachts, inflatable boats, and pleasure boats. This perfectly met Charles's needs. Charles entrusted this task to Tidjany. Tidjany perhaps didn't consider the shock military equipment would have on civilians. When he went to Charles, he drove a large convoy of 100 tanks that needed modification to the shipyard. Charles, the shipyard owner, was terrified. He thought it was because he had provided shipbuilding services to the Germans during their occupation of Mezieres, and he didn't even have time to pack his belongings before trying to escape with his wife and children through the back door. But he failed. Buildings destroyed during the German bombardment blocked his way. In the end, Tidjany sent guards to bring Charles back. Charles was pale and trembling with fear, almost kneeling before Tidjany. This wasn't my choice, Charles explained to the guards repeatedly. They forced me to do this. I didn't want to build ships for them, and I certainly didn't want them to use these ships to transport munitions. The Meuse River connects to Verdun, and much of the munitions and military supplies were transported upstream from Mezieres to Verdun. Mr. Charles, Tidjany called out as he approached him. Perhaps due to excessive panic, or perhaps because of the dim lighting in the factory, Charles didn't recognize Tidjany. He continued to explain rapidly, his words punctuated by a gurgling sound. This has nothing to do with me, General. Please believe me, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. No, I mean, I'm just doing business, that's all. Charles, Tidjany raised his voice. I'm Tidjany, remember? We met in Paris. Charles froze for a moment, staring at Tidjany for a long while, then, as if grasping at a straw, warmly shook hands with Tidjany. So it's you, Mr. Tidjany. Of course I remember you. No, General Tidjany. Look, you're a general now. How is your father, Mr. Wells? Yes, Tidjany nodded. He's fine. If it were you, things would be much easier. Charles forced a smile, glancing at the hundreds of tanks parked in the factory and the heavily armed, menacing soldiers. You see, I'm willing to cooperate with anything. You don't need to bring so many people. Tidjany handed over the blueprints drawn by Charles, shone a flashlight on them, and asked, can these modifications be completed? How long will it take? Charles was taken aback, only then realizing Tidjany's purpose in bringing the tanks. He pressed his chest, taking a few breaths, staring at Tidjany, inwardly cursing, this reckless guy almost scared me to death. Couldn't you have called before coming? Of course, he dared not say these words aloud. He looked at the sketches and answered confidently, yes, General. If all goes well, it can be completed in 2 or 3 hours. The modifications proceeded smoothly. The tents were made of the same rubber as those used in rubber boats, inflatable and layered. The disadvantage of having a partition is that it inflates more slowly, but the advantage is its practicality. Once the rubber is punctured by enemy bullets, it won't leak out completely from one spot, allowing it to remain inflated for a considerable period, much like a hot air balloon. Adding 2 propellers underneath allows for the use of external propellers found on yachts. 2 propellers are used for ease of operation. One moves slowly while the other moves quickly when turning, requiring almost no additional training. The gaps in the tank's chassis are then sealed with rubber and welding to prevent leaks. Finally, a small water pump is added to remove water that seeps into the tank and enclosure. However, in actual combat, the water pump proved largely ineffective because the river crossing time was too short, less than 20 minutes. Chapter 697 How did the tanks get here? While the shipyard was busily modifying tanks, Charles, accompanied by his guards, went to the east bank of the Meuse River for an on-site inspection. It wasn't safe. German shells were raining down on the city without any discernible pattern. Major General Brown tried to stop Charles. You just need to stay in command post, General. I'll have the data you need delivered to you. There won't be any errors. But Charles refused without hesitation. There are many things that cannot be seen or imagined from the rear command post. Only by being there in person and mentally simulating the situation could one discover them. Moreover, this battle was of paramount importance. Failure would mean the complete failure of this infiltration. Charles dared not be careless in the slightest. Therefore, the speed of the water flow, the width and depth of different sections of the river, and the presence of sandbars and reefs within the river were all verified under Charles's command. Ultimately, Charles chose a school as the starting point. This was the Mezire Primary School, located on the riverbank. It was chosen because the river had flooded the school playground, making this flooded area the perfect starting point. It was several hundred meters wide, enough for a dozen amphibious tanks to line up and depart simultaneously, ensuring they could land on the opposite bank almost at the same time and provide sufficient firepower to suppress the enemy. It was a concrete road connected to several paved roads, meeting the tanks' mobility requirements and preventing them from getting stuck in the mud even when submerged. The water depth in the playground section was already 1.3 meters, and the flat, unobstructed terrain allowed the tank crews to conduct trial runs. More importantly, the school was located in the middle of a C-shaped river channel. The amphibious tanks could launch from here, advance in a straight line for about 10 minutes, and then, with the current, their lateral speed would be just close to the landing zone at the end of the C-shaped channel. The troops set off in the dark, calculating the time to arrive on the opposite bank just before dawn. Fortunately, a thick fog fell that day, and Charles organized another artillery barrage to mask the sound of the propellers hitting the water with the explosions. Major General Brownie personally led the operation. Several dangerous situations arose. The swift river formed invisible eddies, spinning Major General Brownie's amphibious tank in the middle of the river. Fortunately, Major General Brownie remained calm under pressure. He ordered the engine to be shut down and drift with the current, waiting for a moment when the tank was stable before suddenly starting it. The amphibious tank successfully escaped the eddies under the combined force of thrust and inertia. Major General Brownie was terrified and couldn't help but curse, "That bastard Charles. His invention is useful, but it's like a toy. This is murder." When Major General Brownie's tank finally landed successfully, he felt like he had escaped death. But before he could even catch his breath, he was immediately bombarded by enemy fire. Major General Brownie ducked back into the tank and directed its advance. Along the way, tanks were everywhere, either stranded or stuck in the mud. The situation on the opposite bank was impossible to ascertain. No one knew the conditions beneath the water. A single misstep could leave one trapped, some even falling into unseen pits. But Brownie, peering through the observation port, quickly discerned a pattern. He looked down and shouted to the driver, "Look at the buildings on both sides. The street must be between them." The driver, realizing the danger, floored the accelerator and sped forward along the middle of the buildings. Sure enough, the tracks parted the water, smoothly surging onto the hard ground. Simultaneously, Major General Brownie maneuvered a machine gun, firing continuously at the enemy on both sides. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, dot. Fleeing German soldiers were shot down, their blood staining the already murky water a shocking red. Some wounded German soldiers lay on the ground trying to rise, but the river water constantly filled their mouths and noses, making it impossible to breathe. However, the more they struggled, the more intense the pain in their wounds became. After several attempts, they couldn't get up and could only struggle helplessly in the water, their movements growing weaker and weaker until finally, as if resigned, they gave up and lay motionless in the water. Gunfire erupted intermittently as French soldiers, following their tanks, relentlessly pursued the Germans, breaking through the German riverbank defenses in a single encounter. At the German Meuse River Command Post, Lieutenant General Nicholas was organizing the regrouping of the retreating troops. After a moment's consideration, he reported to Falkenhayn, "General, if we can blockade Charles's forces, completely encircle Mézières, then we might not need to abandon the defenses north of Mézières. We could even continue the attack on Dunkirk." Falkenhayn stared at the telegram for a moment, stunned. He felt this seemed plausible. If Charles's forces couldn't penetrate in other directions, it would only dig Mézières out of German control, posing little threat to the German defenses. But Falkenhayn still worried that the situation wouldn't be as simple as Nicholas had imagined. "Are you sure you can encircle Charles's 1st Panzer Corps?" Falkenhayn asked. "Yes, I'm sure, Chief of the General Staff," Lieutenant General Nicholas replied. "I can't think of any way he could break through our lines. He'd have to cross the Meuse first. Even if the infantry could, the tanks couldn't." "Good," Falkenhayn telegraphed back. "As you say, I'll have the troops retake the lines." Thus, the German army, which had just received the order for a full retreat, received the order to retake the lines. The 1st Panzer Division, already being transported back by train, stopped halfway. Lieutenant General Nicholas had only one request of Falkenhayn: "I hope you can reinforce me with 5 artillery regiments and 1 infantry division, along with ample ammunition, so I can blockade Charles's forces at Mézières and prevent them from moving." Falkenhayn readily agreed to Lieutenant General Nicholas's request. If they could stop Charles, what did 5 artillery divisions and 1 infantry division matter? Doubling, tripling, or even more wouldn't be a problem. However, just as Lieutenant General Nicholas was studying the map and contemplating how to deploy the approaching troops, a communications soldier rushed into his office in a panic. "General, Charles's troops have landed." Without even looking up, Lieutenant General Nicholas replied, "Then drive them back. Notify the artillery." He naively assumed that opening fire would solve everything. However, the communications soldier reported, "General, they've landed and broken through our lines." They have tanks." "What?" Lieutenant General Nicholas looked up sharply at the communications soldier. "Tanks? How did the tanks get here? Did they swim here?" Chapter 698. Are they ready to surrender? Conventionally, German artillery was positioned 3 to 5 kilometers behind the front lines to avoid being suppressed by French howitzers. More importantly, it was to prevent enemy infantry from breaching the lines and directly threatening the artillery. Note: a straight line distance of 3 to 5 kilometers allows for more reaction time, and in extreme cases, allows for fighting and retreating while defending against an enemy infantry breakthrough. However, on the west bank of the Meuse, the German artillery positions were only 1 kilometer from the front lines. They were not worried about enemy artillery counter-fire or infantry breaches. The Meuse acted as an insurmountable barrier, providing the artillery with a strong sense of security. Colonel Cyril, commander of the 97th Artillery Regiment, was certain of this, and thus spent the entire night directing his troops to fire into the city, not even bothering to move the artillery positions. "Don't worry, they can't hit us." Colonel Cyril glanced around and said to his staff, "Our artillery is positioned 100 or 200 meters apart, while their artillery will reveal their positions once they open fire." This was an asymmetry in artillery warfare between the outside and inside of the city. There were large open spaces outside the city where artillery could be deployed, while inside the city, buildings everywhere meant that artillery could only be placed in any available space. The disadvantage was that the dispersed artillery positions had low accuracy, resulting in indiscriminate bombardment of Mézières. But this situation soon changed. More than 40 howitzers were gradually withdrawn from the front and transferred back to Colonel Cyril's command, and shells continued to be transported down from the front. The artillerymen seemed eager to use up all the shells to speed up the march. This was definitely Colonel Cyril's moment of glory. A colonel commanding more than 70 howitzers was almost equivalent to an artillery division. Thus, the confident Colonel Cyril began to plan the bombing of the Mézières railway station. Colonel Cyril pointed to the map and analyzed. "The train station is the most important place in Mézières. There are over a dozen warehouses there to store supplies. Even though they've dispersed most of their supplies, it's still a transportation hub. Bombing it into ruins will affect the movement of the French army, especially their armored and mechanized units." The staff officer had no objections, but he questioned the bombing itself. "But it's nighttime, Colonel. We can't pinpoint the location. To accurately bombard a target, one must first know its location and then guide the artillery fire step by step through test firing." In the pitch-black night, with Mézières under a complete curfew and no lights, the Germans, even with artillery and shells, were helpless. "So we must prepare," Colonel Cyril said. "Set up positions and get everyone ready for battle. At daybreak, immediately bombard the train station." "Yes, Colonel." As dawn broke, the thick fog disappointed Colonel Cyril. It would affect the artillery's ability to find and pinpoint targets. Colonel Cyril, however, didn't think it was a big problem, because it was a clear day. Once the sun comes up, their doom is nigh. Colonel Cyril ordered his staff to launch 3 reconnaissance planes. This was a risk, because the skies belonged to the French, and their Camel fighters could destroy anything flying in the air. But Colonel Cyril still thought it was worth it. However, he soon realized he was wrong. "Colonel," the communications officer at the phone reported, "our reconnaissance planes have been shot down by the enemy." "Which one?" Colonel Cyril asked. "All of them," the communications officer's answer startled Colonel Cyril. "All of them?" He had originally planned to use the reconnaissance planes to get some air superiority at the crack of dawn, but they were all shot down as soon as they took off. Colonel Cyril frowned. Did this mean that the French fighters had also been prepared for takeoff for some time, which was why they had gained air superiority at daybreak? This seemed bad. The French were also actively preparing for war, and their artillery was likely to retaliate. Sure enough, Colonel Cyril heard the rumble of engines overhead and the gusts of wind whipped up by low-flying planes. He looked up anxiously in the direction of the sound. But he could see nothing in the thick fog, only streaks of black, bat-like shapes darting back and forth. Suddenly, the planes dropped several bombs, which exploded amidst the dense artillery positions, creating a cloud of fire and dust. Colonel Cyril immediately sensed something was wrong. The artillery positions had been discovered, and the planes were using bombs to guide French artillery fire. "Move positions," Colonel Cyril shouted, simultaneously jumping into a vehicle with his men. Artillerymen often did similar things. Whenever they were discovered by the enemy, they had to move as quickly as possible, which was why Colonel Cyril had set up his command post in a car. But to Colonel Cyril's surprise, the expected French artillery fire did not arrive. There was no whistling of shells, no shells exploding nearby, only the roar of engines in the air. Wait, the engine roaring doesn't just seem to be coming from the sky, it's coming from the ground too. Colonel Cyril looked back in the direction of the sound, looking confused. What was that? The deep, powerful rumble continued behind them, unlike an airplane. Colonel Cyril listened intently and finally heard the creaking of tracks. "It's a tank." Colonel Cyril breathed a sigh of relief, his heart finally at ease. Tanks meant they were on his side, because Charles' tanks couldn't have crossed the Meuse River silently. "We have reinforcements," Colonel Cyril announced excitedly. The German artillerymen cheered, their movements slowing as they packed away their guns. Since there was no French artillery fire, they planned to welcome this tank reinforcement. However, a tank suddenly emerged from the billowing fog. The German soldiers froze. It wasn't the familiar Upper Silesia, nor the LK series, but a Charles A1, the French Charles A1. Are they captured tanks? Colonel Cyril thought. Probably. These bastards, they shouldn't have put their spoils at the front. It's easy to misunderstand. However, more and more tanks appeared. 1, 2, 3, soon they were everywhere, all Charles A1s, followed by squads of French soldiers with rifles. At that moment, the French soldiers were stunned. They stared at the German artillerymen in front of them, forgetting to fire. Why weren't these Germans running or hiding? Judging by their formation, it seemed like they were welcoming the French. Were they preparing to surrender? Chapter 699 Recapture the bridge. It's unclear who started it, but the German artillery suddenly went into disarray, attempting a last-ditch effort. But it was futile. The French pulled the triggers without hesitation, unleashing a volley of gunfire as German soldiers fell one by one into pools of blood. The intense gunfire continued for several minutes before gradually subsiding, the only sound the French soldiers shouting in broken German, "Hands up, drop your guns if you want to live, we won't hurt you, surrendering is the wise choice." The Germans realized they were no match for the French force. Their artillery lacked combat experience and was poorly equipped, while the French had tanks. The machine guns and 37mm cannons on the tank turrets exerted immense pressure and intimidation on the German artillerymen, who had never engaged in close combat. Before the battle even reached its climax, the German artillerymen surrendered en masse. This was the second large-scale French capture. The first was in Meuse, where the amount of ammunition and supplies captured was countless, too much to count. What is known is that the 7 warehouses located in the forests of the Ardennes region and the 13 warehouses near the train station were almost full. With these supplies, there was basically no need to worry about food, ammunition, and fuel. Even if the city were completely blockaded by the German army, it could last for several months. The second instance was the raid on the German artillery positions on the west bank of the Meuse River. In this battle, 63 German 105mm howitzers were captured intact, along with a large quantity of shells. This type of artillery was an absolute treasure for the French army, which was desperately short of large-caliber howitzers. At this time, Schneider had been producing them at full capacity and importing them from Italy, but even then, they had only accumulated 103. There were only 103 in the entire country, and they dared not deploy them to the battlefield for fear that they would be quickly consumed by the German army due to their lack of mass production. However, Charles captured 63 of them on the battlefield in one go. After their victory, the French army did not stop. They advanced southward along the Meuse River without stopping, Because the German defenses were deployed along the river, and the 1st Panzer Division was positioned about 1 kilometer behind them, the advance was met with nothing but artillery, command posts, logistics units, and warehouses. All these units were easily overwhelmed, and even those that managed a few hasty resistances were easily routed after a few shots. Ultimately, the French destroyed 10 regimental-level command posts, 6 brigade-level command posts, 4 divisional-level command posts, and 2 corps-level command posts. They killed, wounded, and captured as many as 33 major generals, and countless colonels. Even Lieutenant General Nicholas, commander of the 21st Army, fled in haste, unable to take or destroy the confidential documents in his command post. This allowed the French to immediately obtain intelligence on all nearby German forces, including precise locations, troop strength, and unit numbers. Most importantly, just over half an hour later, the 1st Panzer Division successfully captured a bridge 7 kilometers upstream. The bridge had been rigged with explosives by the Germans, and an infantry battalion was deployed there to protect it. Their orders were, if they couldn't hold the bridge, blow it up to ensure the French couldn't cross. However, all the higher command posts had been bulldozed by the 1st Panzer Division, leaving the unit without command, communication, or even knowledge of what was happening on the main forces' side. Without orders to blow up the bridge, they dared not act rashly, as the main forces' reinforcements to Sedan relied on this bridge. More importantly, their orders were to ensure the French cannot cross this bridge. Now, the French weren't coming from the other side of the bridge, but had suddenly appeared on their flanks and rear. Did this meet the conditions for blowing up the bridge? Certainly not. Should they blow it up or not? If they did, what if the Germans needed the bridge for a counterattack or to encircle Mézières? They only had a few minutes to consider, and then they saw French tanks rumbling towards them. Machine guns and artillery rained down on them, and fighter planes swooped down from the sky. Ultimately, Captain Noah, stationed at the bridge, chose to do nothing and flee with his men. After successfully capturing the bridge, the rest became much simpler. The 1st Panzer Corps had over 300 tanks, but only 100 were urgently converted into amphibious tanks to cross the river, and 27 were lost in the battle. Most of these tanks got stuck in the mud or had their engines flooded and were beyond repair. Without capturing the bridge, the 200 tanks at Mézières would have faced difficulties crossing the river unless a pontoon bridge was built or all of them were converted into amphibious tanks. Even so, supply and reinforcement problems would still exist during future incursions, and the west and east banks of the Meuse River were easily separated by the German forces, making communication impossible. Now that the bridge was under French control, all these problems were solved. Charles immediately dispatched a mechanized regiment to guard the bridge, and then reinforced it with 2 newly captured artillery regiments, one on the west bank and one on the east bank. In Paris, France, by dawn, people had not yet received news of the victory at the front. After a night of reflection, the citizens of Paris gradually recovered from the euphoria of recapturing Mézières. They noticed that Charles's troops had failed to expand their gains and were instead showing signs of being surrounded and killed by the Germans in Mézières. In the morning, people bought newspapers that contained many unfavorable comments about Charles. This is not good news. Although Charles has recaptured Mézières, if he cannot break out of the encirclement, it's just a recapture of Mézières, yes, and Mézières will become ruins. We will gain nothing because the Germans will bomb it flat. This could very well be Charles's most disastrous incursion. Although he successfully crossed the Ardennes, which is surprising, the results are not as significant as expected. We even have to consider the resettlement of the civilians in Mézières. What will happen to them? Will they escape through the Ardennes to Belgium? The capitalists and members of parliament secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Charles's defeat was their victory, otherwise, Charles might have become an unassailable force through this battle. However, just as they mustered their courage again to bribe mouthpieces and try to spread rumors unfavorable to Charles, news of victory came again from the front. Charles has defeated the Germans, once again. At dawn this morning, Charles's troops broke through the German encirclement, and the German army was routed. The German army's defensive line on the west bank of the Meuse River no longer exists. 3 infantry divisions and 1 artillery division, with a total strength of more than 70,000 men. The Germans had the natural barrier of the Meuse River and an absolute numerical advantage, but they were still ruthlessly defeated by Charles. The French people once again cheered loudly for Charles's victory. Chapter 700 Fatal Weakness. Inside the Prime Minister's office at Paris City Hall, smoke filled the air. Brian and Clemenceau, cigars dangling from their fingers, silently flipped through the newly delivered newspaper. None of Charles's actions and measures had been reported to Paris, and even when reports were made, they were delayed, sometimes hours, sometimes days. Therefore, they could only learn about the latest battle developments from the newspapers. It's ironic, Clemenceau thought, finding it an insult to Parliament and the government. Doesn't the military know they need the approval of Parliament and the government to fight? And now we don't even know what's happening on the front lines. It's wartime, Your Excellency, Brian replied helplessly. If decisions in wartime require the approval of Parliament and the government, all we can expect is defeat, and utter defeat at that. This wasn't Brian's opinion, it was the suggestion from Gallieni, Pétain, Foch, and others who stood on the same side. The latest suggestion came from Gallieni. You know what Parliament is like, Your Excellency. It's full of spies from all over the world, including German spies. The battle plans we discussed in Parliament today will be known to the Germans tomorrow. Do you think we can win like this? Pétain telegraphed his support for Gallieni. The members of Parliament are a bunch of people who don't understand military affairs or warfare. It's hard to imagine that we need their approval to formulate battle plans. If we must do this, I have a good suggestion. We can let the members of Parliament train on the battlefield. If every member of Parliament could be like Colonel Drian, I would have no objection. Note, Colonel Drian was a member of Parliament who volunteered to join the army after the outbreak of war and died in the Battle of Verdun. Foch, on the other hand, rushed back to Paris from the Somme front to persuade Briand. Now is a critical moment, Your Excellency. If we were fighting trench warfare and defensive battles, we might be able to let Parliament control the military operations as before, because it hasn't changed much, but now we are fighting mobile warfare, infiltration warfare, and Charles is attacking the Germans. If parliamentary approval is still needed, it's tantamount to tying Charles's hands and feet and forcing him to fight the Germans. Brian was actually quite willing to tie Charles's hands and feet and force him to fight the Germans. However, Gallieni was the Minister of War, Pétain was the backbone of the defense of Verdun, and Foch was the commander-in-chief of both the French and Allied forces. The attitudes of these three, along with Charles, practically represented the entire military. Even as Prime Minister, Brian dared not openly confront them. Moreover, Brian had no reason to confront them, because even a fool would know that in a crisis, the military should be given sufficient freedom, unless he didn't want the French to win. Thus, the final result was that Brian and Clemenceau found themselves seemingly sidelined. They were losing control of the military and the war. Clemenceau was somewhat annoyed. He threw the newspaper on the table and said bitterly, Foch, Pétain, and that Gamelin who's called the smartest man in France, what are they doing? Is there no one besides Charles who can win a battle? Whoever won a battle would be hailed as a paragon by Parliament and capitalists. This way, they could support another force within the military to compete with the Tsar. Unfortunately, almost all the victories were won by the Tsar, even combining the contributions of everyone else paled in comparison. Brian placed the newspaper in front of Clemenceau, pointing to a report, and said, could these people you're talking about have come up with such a method and such equipment? Clemenceau glanced at the newspaper. It was the Heroic Deeds report, which featured a photo of an amphibious tank modified from a Char A1. It was slowly driving into the water, with two soldiers operating it from top to bottom. The image above shows the Sherman DD being launched. Despair filled Brian's eyes. He only used one night, Charles, to be precise, only 10 hours. He came up with this method on the spot, made emergency modifications, and then drove over 100 tanks across the Meuse. No bridges, no pontoon bridges, and no other aids. They just crossed the Meuse and broke through the German lines. Brian became increasingly agitated. Can you imagine? The Germans were defeated just like that. And Gamelin is called the smartest man in France. What an irony. Before Charles, no one was worthy of being called smart. Otherwise, it would be an insult to smartness. Clemenceau leaned back on the sofa, shrugging. Meaning, I agree, but what can we do now? No one can deal with Charles. Brian was silent for a moment, then picked up the phone and told his secretary, have Lieutenant Colonel Dura come to my office. As he hung up, Brian explained to Clemenceau, we need someone who understands military affairs. Clemenceau nodded in agreement. Lieutenant Colonel Dula was the head of the Second Bureau of the General Staff. Although he was in charge of intelligence work, he was a graduate of a military academy and had participated in actual combat with outstanding performance. Soon, Lieutenant Colonel Dula stood before Brian. Brian asked Lieutenant Colonel Dula cryptically, "Lieutenant Colonel, I think you already know about Charles's victory on the front lines. It was a glorious victory, the whole country is thrilled by it. However, out of concern, I'd like to know your opinion, such as what weaknesses Charles's plan had? Or do you know any more detailed information?" Lieutenant Colonel Dula was actually well aware of Brian and his group's desire to bring down Charles. This couldn't be called treason, it was just that the Parliament and the government didn't want to see a figure like Charles rise so powerfully and uncontrollably. Lieutenant Colonel Dula, of course, dared not point it out, feigning concern. "Yes, Your Excellency, Prime Minister, I have been analyzing Charles's battles, or rather, studying them. I have observed that Charles's infiltration this time is different from previous infiltrations, and this could very well become a fatal weakness." Clemenceau's eyes lit up, and he involuntarily sat up straight. "A fatal weakness?" "Yes, Your Excellency," Lieutenant Colonel Dula replied calmly. "In previous infiltrations, Charles's 1st Panzer Corps was always accompanied by a large number of infantry. For example, Foch's troops followed in the infiltration of Antwerp, and Albert I's troops followed in the infiltration of Hasselt. These infantry could follow behind the 1st Panzer Corps to take over and control the trenches and cities that Charles had recaptured. But this time..." Brian and Clemenceau exchanged glances, their faces beaming with joy. "This time he didn't bring any infantry. To successfully cross the Ardennes, Charles only brought the 1st Panzer Corps." End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.